Hello and welcome. Imagine the late 1930s, a world uneasy, filled with whispers of conflict, but still holding on to the fragile hope that the First World War, the war to end all wars, had been humanity's last great tragedy. The air was heavy with memory and with denial. Politicians spoke of peace, but their eyes scanned maps with restless energy. Borders seemed fixed, but behind the lines, nations prepared silently for what was to come. This chapter explores those quiet and often forgotten beginnings of World War II, the strange coincidences, the overlooked battles, and the hidden sparks that ignited the firestorm of 1939. Many of these details slip out of the history books, overshadowed by the grand narratives of blitzkriegs and D-Day. But they matter, for they show how the war was never just the result of one speech, one invasion, or one dictator's ambition. It was a tapestry of hidden threads woven from forgotten events across the globe. The shadows before the storm. In Europe, the Treaty of Versailles had ended World War I 2 decades earlier, but the ink on that document never truly dried. For Germany, the treaty was a wound, cutting deep into its economy, its pride, and its future. The reparations demanded from Germany crippled its currency. By the early 1920s, people carried wheelbarrows of money to buy a loaf of bread. That humiliation simmered for years, and by the 1930s, it became fuel for a fiery nationalist revival. But here's the forgotten part. Germany was not alone in feeling discontent. Italy, despite being on the winning side of WWII, felt cheated of its promised rewards. Japan, too, had fought alongside the Allies, but left the Versailles negotiations bitter that it was not treated as an equal power. These grievances brewed in silence. The world thought it had peace, but in truth it was building pressure for another explosion. Across the seas, the United States embraced isolation. Not our fight, most Americans believed, weary after their own WWII sacrifices. This left Europe and Asia to wrestle with problems on their own. Into this vacuum of leadership stepped ambitious men, Adolf Hitler in Germany, Benito Mussolini in Italy, and militarist generals in Japan. Each looked outward, hungry for expansion. The cavalry myth of Poland. When Germany finally invaded Poland on September 1, 1939, newspapers across the world told a story that still survives in popular memory. Polish cavalry charging German tanks with swords. It is a dramatic, almost tragic image, brave horsemen facing machines of war. But the truth is far more complex and less well known. The Polish army did indeed use cavalry, but not in the medieval sense. These units were mobile, trained to fight both on horseback and on foot. In one famous skirmish, Polish cavalry attacked German infantry, successfully scattering them. Then, German armored vehicles arrived, and the scene turned deadly. Observers exaggerated the moment, spreading the myth that Poland sent horses against tanks. This story became propaganda, repeated for decades as an example of Poland's supposed backwardness. Yet in reality, Poland fought fiercely with modern weapons, including tanks and aircraft. The myth of the cavalry charge hides the resilience and modernization Poland had already begun, though sadly overwhelmed by the combined weight of Germany invading from the west and the Soviet Union invading from the east. Japan's forgotten war before World War II. We often think of World War II starting in 1939, but in truth, Japan had already been at war for years. In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria, carving out a puppet state called Manchukuo. By 1937, the Second Sino-Japanese War erupted in full force. Cities like Nanjing witnessed horrors that shocked the world, though the world did little to stop it. But one of the forgotten early clashes lies not in China, but along the Mongolian frontier in 1939. At a place called Khalkhin-Gol, Japanese forces clashed with Soviet troops commanded by a relatively unknown general named Georgy Zhukov. The battle lasted months, involving tanks, planes, and tens of thousands of men. In the end, Zhukov orchestrated a brilliant counterattack that encircled the Japanese and forced a humiliating defeat. This forgotten battle mattered more than many realize. After Khalkhin Gol, Japan chose not to attack the Soviet Union again, instead turning its attention southward toward the Pacific. Meanwhile, Zhukov's victory made his reputation, paving the way for his later role in defending Moscow and capturing Berlin. Thus, a remote battle in the Asian steppe helped shape the entire course of the war. Secret diplomacy and strange pacts. Another curious fact of the war's beginnings lies in the strange bedfellows it created. Few secrets shocked the world more than the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, signed in August 1939 between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. On the surface, it was a non-aggression treaty, Hitler and Stalin promising not to fight each other. But the secret protocol attached to the treaty carved up Eastern Europe in advance, dividing Poland, the Baltic states, and parts of Romania between the two powers. The world was stunned. How could two ideological enemies, Nazis and communists, agree to peace? For Stalin, it was a way to buy time. For Hitler, it secured his eastern flank. But hidden inside this cold logic was tragedy. Millions of people lived in territories casually divided on a map, soon to be swallowed by occupation. And yet, even here, forgotten threads appear. Some Soviet citizens in Ukraine and the Baltic welcomed German troops at first, seeing them as liberators from Stalin's brutal rule. Few realized that they were trading one tyranny for another. These local reactions, often erased in later histories, remind us how complex human choices were in those desperate times. The Winter War, a frozen struggle. Just months after the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, another conflict erupted that is often left in the shadows: the Winter War between Finland and the Soviet Union. In November 1939, Stalin demanded territory from Finland, hoping to push the border away from Leningrad. When Finland refused, the Soviets invaded. What followed was a brutal struggle in ice and snow. Finnish soldiers, vastly outnumbered and outgunned, fought with extraordinary creativity. Ski troops glided silently through forests, striking Soviet convoys before vanishing into the snow. They used Molotov cocktails, simple bottles of fuel ignited on impact, against Soviet tanks. The world watched in awe as little Finland held out against the Red Army. Though the Soviets eventually forced Finland to cede territory, the war damaged Stalin's reputation and exposed the weaknesses of the Soviet military. Some historians argue that Hitler's later decision to invade the Soviet Union in 1941 was influenced by watching this struggle, mistakenly believing the Red Army was weak. And so, a frozen conflict on the edge of Europe rippled outward, influencing the course of the larger war. Forgotten skies. Another often overlooked beginning lies in the skies. Before Britain and Germany clashed in the Battle of Britain, smaller air wars were already testing new technologies. For example, during the Spanish Civil War, 1936-1939, German and Italian pilots flew alongside Francisco Franco's nationalists, testing planes and tactics. The bombing of Guernica, immortalized by Picasso's painting, was one of the first modern aerial terror attacks, foreshadowing the blitzes to come. Likewise, in China, Japanese planes tested bombing campaigns on major cities years before World War II officially began. Civilians became targets not because of accident, but because militaries were experimenting with total war, the idea that every aspect of a nation could be attacked. These forgotten experiments hardened strategies that would later devastate London, Dresden, Tokyo, and Hiroshima. Global echoes. Though the war began in Europe, its early rumblings reached far corners of the globe. In South America, for instance, Germany maintained networks of influence, and countries like Brazil and Argentina debated their positions. In Africa, colonial troops prepared quietly, often without realizing how soon they would be shipped to distant battlefields. Even in remote islands, change was felt. The Pacific Ocean, dotted with colonial outposts, became a chessboard of preparation. Few villagers in places like Guam or the Solomon Islands could imagine that soon their homes would become battlegrounds of global importance. These forgotten echoes remind us that the war was never only European. It was truly global from the beginning, with quiet tremors felt in lands far from Berlin or Warsaw. The Second World War is often remembered as a sudden eruption, a lightning strike of violence when Hitler marched into Poland. But the deeper truth is that the war was not sudden at all. It was the result of years of hidden movements, forgotten battles, and curious twists that quietly laid the foundation for the global storm. This section continues to explore those overlooked beginnings, the odd stories, the missed opportunities for peace, and the strange episodes that shaped the way the conflict unfolded. Chamberlain's peace paper. One of the most enduring images of the pre-war years is British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain stepping off a plane in 1938, waving a sheet of paper and declaring, "Peace for our time." The Munich Agreement, which allowed Germany to annex the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia, has since become a symbol of appeasement. But what is often forgotten is the relief that moment brought to ordinary Europeans. After the horrors of 1914-1918, almost everyone dreaded another war. When Chamberlain returned from meeting Hitler, many people cheered him. They wanted to believe peace was still possible. For a brief moment, Europe breathed easier. Behind the smiles, however, was a darker truth. Czechoslovakia had been betrayed without its consent. Hitler saw appeasement not as generosity, but as weakness. The Munich Agreement postponed war, but it did not prevent it. Within a year, the conflict Chamberlain so desperately hoped to avoid had begun. The forgotten detail is that appeasement was not just cowardice, it was also exhaustion. The people of Europe simply could not imagine enduring another world war so soon. The curious case of Danzig. Another little-known aspect of the war's beginnings lies in the port city of Danzig, today known as Gdansk in Poland. Danzig was a free city under the League of Nations, but with a strong German population. Hitler demanded its return to Germany, making it one of the flashpoints that led to the invasion of Poland. But beyond the political drama, Danzig had its own strange stories. Secret Nazi militias operated in the city before the war, training in the shadows. When the German battleship Schleswig-Holstein opened fire on the Polish garrison at Westerplatte on September 1, 1939, it was not just an invasion, it was also the eruption of years of underground preparation. The forgotten detail is that the Westerplatte garrison held out for 7 days against overwhelming odds. Though Poland would fall, those defenders became symbols of resistance, showing that even in the earliest days of the war, courage and defiance still burned brightly. Norway and the Iron Roots. Most histories leap quickly from the invasion of Poland to the fall of France. But even in the early months of the war, strategic struggles were unfolding in unexpected places. One of the most curious was in Norway. At first glance, Norway seemed far from the centers of power, yet it became a target because of iron ore. Much of Germany's steel production relied on iron shipped from Sweden. In winter, when the Baltic Sea froze, those shipments traveled through the Norwegian port of Narvik. Britain and France realized that if they could block this route, Germany's war machine would suffer. In April 1940, Germany acted first, launching Operation Weserübung to occupy Norway and Denmark. The campaign is often overshadowed by the later fall of France, but it had lasting consequences. Denmark fell in a single day. Norway resisted, with British and French forces even landing to support it. But ultimately, Germany secured control. The forgotten detail is that Britain's failure in Norway contributed directly to the fall of Chamberlain's government and the rise of Winston Churchill. A campaign on icy fjords shaped the leadership that would guide Britain through the darkest days of the war. The Phony War. After the fall of Poland in September 1939, The world expected Germany to turn westward immediately. Yet for months, almost nothing happened on the Western Front. This period from late 1939 to spring 1940 became known as the Phony War. British and French troops lined up against German forces along the border, but there were no major attacks. Instead, soldiers passed the time in strange ways, building snowmen, playing cards, even visiting nearby towns. Civilians in France lived almost normally, believing the war might simply fade away. What many forget is that this calm was deceptive. Germany was building its strength, planning a massive strike through the Low Countries and into France. The Allies, meanwhile, relied too heavily on static defenses like the Maginot Line. The phony war lulled many into complacency. When the German blitzkrieg finally came in May 1940, it swept aside those illusions with terrifying speed. The Battle of the River Plate. While Europe waited, a curious battle unfolded far away off the coast of South America. In December 1939, the German pocket battleship Admiral Graf Spee faced British ships near the River Plate, off Uruguay. The Graf Spee had been raiding Allied merchant ships in the South Atlantic, threatening vital trade routes. When cornered by 3 British cruisers, it fought a sharp battle, damaging its pursuers but also suffering serious hits. Captain Hans Langsdorff steered his ship into Montevideo harbor, seeking repairs and refuge. Here lies the forgotten twist. Uruguay, a neutral country, limited how long the Graf Spee could stay. For many in the West, this passed almost unnoticed. The world was focused on the battles raging elsewhere, but for the people of the Baltics, it was the beginning of decades of occupation. Families were deported to Siberia, national leaders imprisoned or executed. This silent annexation is often overshadowed by Germany's dramatic invasions, yet it reveals how World War II was not only about tanks and battles. It was also about the quiet swallowing of nations, erased on maps almost overnight. Forgotten battles of 1939-1940. Several other skirmishes in these early years are rarely remembered. In late 1939, the Soviet Union fought a brief war with Japan in Mongolia. Even after Khalkhin Gol, tensions simmered until the two nations signed a neutrality pact in 1941. In 1940, Italy invaded Egypt from its colony in Libya, opening the North African front earlier than many recall. British forces pushed them back in daring desert campaigns. Small naval clashes erupted in the North Sea, with mines and U-boats already making life dangerous for merchant sailors. Each of these forgotten fights shows that while the world thought the war was contained, in truth, it was spreading rapidly. Neutral nations on edge. Another overlooked detail is how neutral nations navigated these uncertain times. Sweden, Switzerland, Spain, Turkey each walked a tightrope. Sweden maintained neutrality but allowed German iron shipments to continue, a decision that critics later condemned. Switzerland braced itself, ringed by Axis powers but never invaded. Spain, recovering from its civil war, leaned toward Germany but stayed out of the conflict, providing quiet support instead. Turkey balanced between Axis and Allies until the war's final stages. These forgotten diplomatic maneuvers remind us that neutrality in a world war was rarely pure. Even nations that stayed out were drawn into the orbit of the conflict, pressured, threatened, and sometimes complicit. The human side of the early war. Perhaps the most overlooked aspect of these beginnings is the human experience. For millions, the war began not with tanks or planes, but with rumors, shortages, and quiet fear. In Poland, families fled eastward only to meet Soviet troops instead of safety. In Britain, children were evacuated from cities even before the first bombs fell, sent to live with strangers in the countryside. In China, villages endured Japanese occupation years before Europe truly ignited. These personal stories rarely make it into grand histories, yet they show how the war began not as a distant clash of leaders, but as a disruption of ordinary lives. The early years were filled with confusion, misinformation, and a desperate hope that somehow It might all end quickly. A war already global. By the time Germany invaded France in 1940, the Second World War was already global in scope. From the snows of Finland to the jungles of China, from the fjords of Norway to the rivers of South America, battles, occupations, and secret deals had unfolded. The world simply did not yet realize the scale of what was beginning. The forgotten truth is that World War II did not start suddenly. It crept forward in hidden steps, in obscure battles and secret treaties. Its beginnings were unlikely, scattered across continents, yet bound together by a common thread, the failure of peace to hold in a world still scarred by the memory of the last war. When most people think of the Second World War, their minds jump quickly to Europe, the fall of France, the Blitz over London, the clash between Hitler and Stalin. Yet from the very beginning, the war's reach stretched into Africa. It was there, in deserts, mountains, and tropical landscapes, that thousands of soldiers fought battles now largely forgotten. These African campaigns shaped the war in unexpected ways, even if they remain less familiar than D-Day or Stalingrad. To explore the African front is to step into a part of history where geography, colonialism, and global strategy intersected. Africa was not simply a backdrop to the war. It was an active theater where the ambitions of European empires collided and where African soldiers were drawn into a conflict that was not of their making. Their contribution, often overlooked, was immense. Italy's ambitions in East Africa. When Italy entered the war in June 1940, Mussolini dreamed of building a new Roman Empire. He already controlled Libya in North Africa and Eritrea, Somalia, and Ethiopia in the east. To him, the war was an opportunity to link these territories, stretching Italian power across the continent. In East Africa, Italy had a sizable force, nearly 250,000 men spread across Eritrea, Italian Somaliland, and Ethiopia, which had been annexed after the 1935-36 war against Emperor Haile Selassie. At first, Mussolini's forces advanced quickly. In the summer of 1940, they crossed into British Somaliland and captured it. For a brief time, Italian flags flew over cities like Berbera. But Italy's early victories were misleading. Supply lines stretched across harsh terrain. The Italian colonies were isolated, cut off by British naval control of the Red Sea. As the months passed, their situation worsened. By 1941, British, Indian, South African, and African colonial troops launched counterattacks, retaking Somaliland and pushing deep into Ethiopia. The forgotten detail is how diverse these forces were. Soldiers from Sudan, Kenya, Nigeria, and other colonies fought alongside Europeans. For many, it was the first time they had traveled beyond their own regions. The war in Africa was not only a European affair, it became part of African lives and memories. Haile Selassie's return. One of the most dramatic stories of this campaign was the return of Emperor Haile Selassie. Forced into exile after Italy's conquest of Ethiopia in 1936, Selassie spent years pleading with the League of Nations and the world for support. When Britain and its allies pushed back against Italy in East Africa, Selassie saw his chance. In January 1941, he crossed back into Ethiopia with the support of Gideon Force, a small but determined unit made up of British officers and Ethiopian patriots. Together, they waged guerrilla warfare, harassing Italian troops and inspiring local resistance. By May, Selassie entered Addis Ababa to cheering crowds. His return symbolized not only Ethiopia's survival, but also Africa's resilience. For Ethiopians, this victory was deeply significant. Ethiopia had been one of the few independent African states before the war, and its survival was a blow against colonial domination. Yet outside Ethiopia, this story is often barely mentioned. The Second World War in Africa was not only about battles, it was also about sovereignty, dignity, and the fight for independence. The Desert War in North Africa. While East Africa burned, the deserts of North Africa became another crucial front. At first, Italy again took the initiative. In September 1940, Italian troops crossed from Libya into Egypt, then under British control. Their goal was Alexandria and the Suez Canal, lifeline of the British Empire. The Italians advanced about 60 miles before stalling. Their supply problems, poor equipment, and low morale made progress difficult. In December, the British launched Operation Compass. In a series of daring moves, they encircled Italian divisions, capturing tens of thousands of prisoners. It was one of the most humiliating defeats of the war for Mussolini's forces. But this victory would not last. Alarmed by Italy's collapse, Hitler intervened. In early 1941, he sent a small but highly mobile force, the Afrika Korps, under General Erwin Rommel. With his daring tactics and speed, Rommel quickly earned the nickname the Desert Fox. His arrival transformed the Desert War into a long seesaw struggle. Life in the desert. The desert campaigns of North Africa were unique in the history of warfare. Soldiers faced not only enemy fire but also the elements themselves. Temperatures soared by day and plummeted by night. Sandstorms blinded men and clogged engines. Water was precious. A soldier might be allotted less than a liter a day. Vehicles broke down constantly, forcing mechanics to improvise repairs with whatever scrap they could find. Food supplies often consisted of monotonous rations, hardtack biscuits, tinned meat, and powdered tea. In letters home, soldiers described how sand found its way into everything: weapons, clothing, even food. Yet despite these hardships, there was also a strange camaraderie. British and German troops sometimes fought each other with a certain respect, sharing the same harsh conditions. Rommel himself was admired by opponents for his chivalry, though his reputation grew partly from Allied propaganda. This side of the war is often forgotten because it lacks the drama of city bombings or vast tank battles. But for the men who served there, the desert was as deadly an enemy as any army. African soldiers in a European war. Perhaps the most overlooked aspect of the African fronts is the role of African soldiers themselves. Hundreds of thousands were drawn into the war by colonial powers. The French recruited soldiers from West Africa, known as tirailleurs sénégalais, who fought bravely in both Africa and Europe. The British mobilized men from Nigeria, Kenya, Uganda, and beyond. These soldiers often faced racism and poor treatment, yet they carried heavy burdens. They marched through jungles and deserts, hauled supplies, and fought in battles that determined the war's course. Many returned home wounded or traumatized, their sacrifices rarely recognized. For example, in Burma, African soldiers were deployed against the Japanese far from their homelands. In Ethiopia, local fighters joined Allied forces to reclaim their land. Across the continent, the war left scars that shaped African societies long after 1945. The forgotten truth is that the Second World War in Africa was not simply an extension of European struggles. It was also a deeply African experience involving African people as participants, not just bystanders. The war in Madagascar. One of the strangest and least remembered African campaigns took place on the island of Madagascar. In 1942, the Allies feared that Japan might use Madagascar, then under Vichy French control, as a base to threaten shipping routes in the Indian Ocean. In May, British forces launched Operation Ironclad, landing near the port of Diego Suarez. The fighting was intense, with French and Malagasy defenders resisting fiercely. Eventually, the British secured the island, though it took months of skirmishes to pacify it fully. This forgotten campaign mattered because it secured vital sea lanes between Africa, India, and the Pacific. Without it, Allied convoys might have been vulnerable to Japanese submarines. Yet in most histories, Madagascar receives only a passing mention, if any at all. South Africa's role. South Africa, a dominion of the British Empire, also played a key role in the African War. Its forces fought in East Africa, North Africa, and later in Italy. South African pilots patrolled skies, while soldiers fought in deserts and mountains. Yet the war also exposed deep divisions at home. Not all South Africans supported fighting for Britain. Some Afrikaners, still resentful of British rule after the Boer War, sympathized with Germany. These tensions simmered throughout the conflict, shaping South Africa's politics for decades to come. The forgotten contribution of South Africa lies not only in its troops, but also in its industry. Factories produced weapons, vehicles, and supplies for the Allied war effort, making the country a vital part of the global supply chain. The African fronts of World War II are often overlooked, yet they were crucial. From the deserts of Libya to the mountains of Ethiopia, from the jungles of Madagascar to the factories of South Africa, Africa was a battlefield, a resource hub, and a source of soldiers. For Africans, the war was both imposed and transformative. It disrupted lives, exposed injustices, and sowed seeds of change. After 1945, many veterans returned home with new ideas and expectations, fueling the push for independence across the continent. These forgotten African stories remind us that the Second World War was truly global. Its battles were not confined to Europe or the Pacific. They spread into every corner of the earth, leaving traces still visible today. The story of World War II in Africa is a story of contrasts. It is a story of deserts where men marched until their boots fell apart, of jungles where humidity rotted weapons, of highland battles fought among clouds. It is a story of European empires fighting on African soil, but also of African men and women whose lives were drawn into a struggle far beyond their borders. The war in Africa was not one single campaign. It was a series of overlapping struggles: East Africa, North Africa, Madagascar, and the involvement of African colonies. Each front reveals different aspects of the global war: strategy, survival, and forgotten heroism. The long struggle in East Africa. By early 1941, the East African campaign was in full swing. British, Indian, and African troops advanced from Sudan, Kenya, and Aden, striking into Italian-held Eritrea and Ethiopia. These attacks were not easy. The terrain was mountainous, the climate harsh, and supply lines fragile. Yet step by step, the Allies pressed forward. One of the fiercest battles took place at Keren in Eritrea in March 1941. Italian forces, including elite mountain troops, defended rugged hills and narrow passes. For weeks, Allied soldiers tried to dislodge them, enduring sniper fire, rock slides, and relentless counterattacks. Finally, after a massive assault, the Allies broke through. The fall of Keren opened the way to Asmara and Massawa, crippling Italy's hold on East Africa. At the same time, Ethiopian patriots known as the Abenyoch, or resistance fighters, fought from the countryside. They ambushed convoys, sabotaged supply lines, and guided Allied troops. Their knowledge of the land proved invaluable. When Emperor Haile Selassie re-entered Addis Ababa in May 1941, it was not only a symbolic triumph, it marked the end of Italian East Africa and the return of Ethiopian sovereignty. Yet the cost was high. Villages were destroyed, civilians displaced, and famine spread in areas cut off by war. These scars lingered long after the guns fell silent. The tug-of-war in North Africa. If East Africa was a campaign of mountains and forests, North Africa was one of vast, open deserts. Here, mobility was everything. Tanks, trucks, and aircraft determined victory more than sheer numbers. Rommel's Afrika Korps became legendary for its speed. In early 1941, he launched bold offensives that pushed the British back across Libya and into Egypt. His use of surprise, feints, and rapid armored thrusts caught opponents off guard. At times, British generals described fighting Rommel as trying to stop quicksilver. It slipped through their fingers before they could react. Yet Rommel's brilliance was not unlimited. His supply lines stretched across the Mediterranean, vulnerable to Allied ships and aircraft. The desert magnified every shortage. Without fuel, tanks became useless hulks. Without water, soldiers weakened. Logistics, more than strategy, often decided the desert war. By late 1942, the tide turned. At El Alamein in Egypt, British forces under General Bernard Montgomery launched a massive assault. With superior numbers, better supply, and carefully planned tactics, they broke Rommel's lines. The battle was brutal, with minefields, artillery, and close-quarters fighting, but when it ended, the Axis began a long retreat westward. Winston Churchill later declared, "Before Alamein, we never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat." While perhaps overstated, the sentiment captured the turning point. North Africa was no longer a stage for Axis dreams of expansion. Instead, it became the foundation for the Allied advance into Italy. Forgotten battles within the desert. Between the headline victories and defeats lay dozens of smaller, often forgotten clashes. At Tobruk in Libya, Australian and British troops held out under siege for months in 1941, enduring constant bombardment. Their stubborn defense tied down Axis forces and became a symbol of resilience. The Rats of Tobruk, as they proudly called themselves, lived in dugouts, cooking meager meals over tin-can stoves, refusing to surrender. In Operation Crusader later that year, Allied and Axis forces clashed in a swirling series of battles across the desert. Victory shifted back and forth as tanks and infantry surged across open plains. The campaign was confusing, exhausting, and costly, but it showed that the desert was not the domain of one side alone. Each of these forgotten battles contributed to the larger struggle, shaping the morale and strategies of both sides. Yet in most popular histories, they are reduced to footnotes, overshadowed by the more dramatic turning points. African laborers and support troops. Behind the front lines, African civilians played crucial roles that often go unmentioned. Tens of thousands were conscripted or recruited as laborers, porters, and drivers. They carried supplies across deserts, built roads, and maintained camps. Without their work, armies could not move. In East Africa, local guides led columns through treacherous mountain passes. In North Africa, workers repaired railways destroyed by bombing. Many faced harsh conditions, long hours, and little recognition. Some were paid, others coerced. For many, it was an experience that connected them for the first time to global events, exposing them to ideas that would later fuel anti-colonial movements. Their contributions were rarely recorded in official reports, yet their sweat and endurance were as vital as any tank or airplane. The Battle for Madagascar. While desert and mountain campaigns raged, the island of Madagascar became an unexpected battleground in 1942. At first glance, Madagascar seemed far removed from the main theaters of war, but its position in the Indian Ocean made it strategically important. The island was under the control of Vichy France, which collaborated with Germany. The Allies feared that Japan might seize Madagascar to disrupt vital shipping lanes between Africa, India, and the Middle East. To prevent this, Britain launched Operation Ironclad in May 1942. British troops landed near Diego Suarez, facing stiff resistance from French and Malagasy defenders. Fighting was fierce, with naval bombardments and airstrikes pounding coastal defenses. Eventually, the Allies captured the key port, but the campaign dragged on for months as Vichy forces and local militias resisted inland. By November, the entire island was under Allied control. Securing Madagascar ensured safer supply routes in the Indian Ocean, a factor often overlooked in the larger war narrative. For the Malagasy people, however, the war brought upheaval, shortages, and heavy casualties. The North African campaign's global links. What made the North African campaign especially important was its connection to the broader war. Control of North Africa meant control of the Mediterranean. It meant access to the Suez Canal, oil from the Middle East, and shipping routes to Asia. For Germany, victory in North Africa could have opened the way to the Middle East, linking with Axis-friendly movements in Iraq and Iran. For Britain, defeat would have been catastrophic, cutting its empire in half. Thus, the battles of Libya and Egypt were not sideshows. They were central to global strategy. The campaign also drew in forces from around the world. Indian divisions fought in the desert. New Zealanders and Australians traveled halfway across the globe. Free French units loyal to Charles de Gaulle joined the fight. North Africa became a crossroads of nations, with soldiers from every continent converging on its sands. This global dimension is often forgotten. The desert was not only a place where Rommel and Montgomery dueled, it was also where the world gathered to decide the war's future. South African and Rhodesian airmen. Another forgotten aspect of Africa's war lies in the skies. South African and Rhodesian airmen flew countless missions, patrolling coasts, escorting convoys, and supporting ground forces. They flew older aircraft at first, often under difficult conditions, but their role was vital in keeping supply lines open. These pilots faced long hours, limited equipment, and dangerous missions over vast stretches of ocean and desert. Many were lost in action, their stories barely recorded. Yet without their presence, Axis submarines and raiders might have strangled Allied lifelines. Their contribution illustrates again how Africa was not passive ground. It provided men, resources, and strategic positions that shaped the outcome of the war. The seeds of change. While the war in Africa was fought for European interests, it left deep marks on African societies themselves. Veterans returned with new experiences, having fought alongside men from around the world. They had seen the weaknesses of colonial powers and questioned why they should remain subjects. In French West Africa, soldiers who fought in Europe later demanded recognition and rights. In British colonies, veterans became leaders in independence movements. The war exposed contradictions. Europeans spoke of freedom and democracy, yet maintained colonial rule. Thus, the hidden fronts in Africa were not only about battles, they were about transformation. They laid the groundwork for a post-war world in which Africa would no longer accept subjugation without question. By 1943, the African campaigns had largely ended. The Allies controlled North Africa, East Africa was liberated, and Madagascar was secure. From there, the war shifted to Europe, with invasions of Sicily and Italy. Yet Africa's role should never be forgotten. It was the stage for some of the earliest Allied victories, the proving ground for commanders, and the source of men and resources that sustained the war. It was also where African voices began to demand recognition, planting seeds of independence. In the deserts, mountains, and islands of Africa, World War II was fought in ways often overlooked, but never insignificant. When people think of the Pacific War, certain names leap out: Pearl Harbor, Midway, Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima. These battles have become icons, frozen in photographs and film reels, taught in classrooms and remembered in memorials. Yet the Pacific War was far broader than these headline clashes. It stretched across thousands of miles of ocean and through countless islands, large and small. The Pacific is a vast expanse dotted with archipelagos, coral reefs, and volcanic peaks rising from the sea. During the Second World War, it became a chessboard upon which Japan, the United States, Britain, Australia, and other nations maneuvered for control. But beyond the famous battles lay hundreds of smaller fights, forgotten garrisons, and overlooked tragedies. The war in the Pacific Islands was not just about admirals drawing arrows on maps. It was about isolated communities swept into a global storm. This chapter explores those hidden stories, the forgotten battles, the indigenous islanders caught between warring powers, the soldiers who endured years in jungles, and the strange survival tales that still echo today. Japan's early expansion. Long before Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Japan had been expanding across the Pacific. In the years following World War I, it gained control of former German colonies in the Pacific, including the Marshall Islands, the Caroline Islands, and the Mariana Islands. Under the League of Nations mandate, Japan administered these territories but secretly fortified them in violation of international agreements. These islands, scattered across thousands of miles, became stepping stones for Japan's later offensives. From them, aircraft and ships could threaten American possessions like Guam, the Philippines, and Hawaii. The forgotten detail is how quiet this expansion seemed at the time. To most of the world, these islands were remote and unimportant. Few realized that airfields carved out of coral or naval bases hidden in lagoons would soon play decisive roles in a global war. The Aleutian Islands Campaign. One of the most surprising Pacific battles occurred not in the tropics, but in the frozen north. In June 1942, Japanese forces occupied the Aleutian Islands of Attu and Kiska, part of Alaska. Their goal was partly to divert American attention from Midway, partly to secure a northern flank. For the first time since the War of 1812, foreign troops occupied American soil. Yet this fact remains little known. The islands were remote, fog-bound, and sparsely inhabited. Still, the occupation was a blow to American pride. In May 1943, U.S. forces landed on Attu to retake it. What followed was a brutal battle in freezing conditions. Fog rolled over the tundra, obscuring movements. Soldiers suffered frostbite, exhaustion, and disorientation. Japanese defenders fought to the last man, launching a desperate banzai charge that overwhelmed American lines before being crushed. Kiska was retaken a few months later, but the Japanese had already evacuated under cover of fog, leaving behind booby traps and abandoned positions. The Aleutian campaign cost thousands of lives, yet it is rarely remembered in the same breath as Guadalcanal or Normandy. Indigenous islanders in the crossfire. Across the Pacific, indigenous islanders found themselves trapped between empires. For centuries, their lives had been shaped by fishing, farming, and traditions adapted to island life. Suddenly, war transformed their homes into battlefields. On Guadalcanal, Solomon Islanders played a crucial role as scouts and guides for Allied forces. Their knowledge of the terrain, reefs, and hidden paths proved invaluable. The coast watchers, often local men working with Australians, monitored Japanese movements and relayed information by radio, sometimes at great personal risk. In the Philippines, villages sheltered American and Filipino soldiers during the early Japanese occupation, feeding them despite the threat of severe punishment. In New Guinea, indigenous carriers, later called the Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels, helped evacuate wounded Allied troops over rugged jungle tracks, their efforts remembered with deep gratitude. Yet the war also brought suffering. Villages were bombed, food supplies seized, populations forced into labor. Disease spread rapidly in camps and occupied territories. For many island communities, the war was not a distant event, it was devastation at their doorstep. The forgotten garrison of Wake Island. Wake Island, a small atoll in the Central Pacific, became the site of one of the war's earliest and least remembered struggles. In December 1941, just hours after Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces attacked Wake, defended by a small U.S. Marine garrison and civilian contractors. Against overwhelming odds, the defenders repelled the first Japanese landing attempt, sinking 2 destroyers and damaging others. The victory was brief but inspiring, one of the first signs that Japan could be resisted. But later that month, reinforced Japanese forces returned. After a fierce battle, Wake fell. Most of the defenders were taken prisoner. Tragically, nearly 100 civilian workers left behind were executed by the occupiers in 1943, a story often overshadowed by larger atrocities elsewhere. Wake Island illustrates how even tiny atolls became flashpoints. Their names remembered only faintly today, but once symbols of courage and sacrifice. Jungle warfare in New Guinea. One of the most grueling Pacific campaigns took place not on beaches but in the dense jungles of New Guinea. Japanese forces landed on the island in 1942, aiming to capture Port Moresby, a vital Allied base. The Kokoda Track, a rugged mountain trail, became the focus of the struggle. Australian troops, many young and inexperienced, fought desperate battles along the trail, often face to face in the mud. Disease, malaria, dysentery, tropical ulcers claimed more lives than bullets. Supplies were carried by hand or on the backs of indigenous porters. Despite immense hardships, the Australians held the line, eventually pushing the Japanese back. The campaign saved Australia from direct threat and marked one of the first major defeats for Japan on land. The Kokoda campaign is remembered in Australia but remains little known elsewhere. For the men who endured it, however, it was a nightmare of rain, hunger, and exhaustion, fought in some of the harshest terrain on Earth. Soldiers who never returned. One of the strangest legacies of the Pacific War was the soldiers who did not know it had ended. Scattered across remote islands, cut off from communication, some Japanese troops continued to hold out long after 1945. The most famous case was Hiru Onoda, an intelligence officer who hid in the Philippines for nearly 30 years, refusing to believe the war was over. He finally surrendered in 1974 when his former commander personally traveled to release him from duty. Other holdouts existed too, on Guam, Palau, and small islands across the Pacific. Some surrendered years later, others disappeared into the jungle, their fate unknown. These stories, half tragic and half astonishing, reflect the isolation and intensity of the Pacific War. For men conditioned to fight to the death, surrender seemed unthinkable, even when the world had long since moved on. Survival at sea. The vast distances of the Pacific meant that naval battles often left survivors adrift for days or weeks. One of the most dramatic cases was the sinking of the USS Indianapolis in July 1945 after delivering components of the atomic bomb to Tinian. Of nearly 1,200 men on board, around 900 survived the initial sinking. But with rescue delayed, they endured dehydration, exposure, and shark attacks. By the time help arrived, only about 300 remained alive. It was one of the worst naval disasters in American history, yet for decades it received little public attention. Other survival stories abound. Japanese sailors clinging to rafts for weeks, Allied airmen rescued by islanders after ditching planes, submariners trapped in steel coffins beneath the sea. The Pacific was beautiful but merciless, its vastness swallowing countless lives. The war's impact on island ecology. Another often forgotten aspect of the Pacific War was its impact on the natural environment. Coral reefs were blasted by bombs and shells. Forests were cut down to build airstrips. Exotic species were introduced, sometimes accidentally, disrupting local ecosystems. On Guam and other islands, vast numbers of snakes and insects multiplied in the wake of human disruption. Birds disappeared from once quiet lagoons. Even today, rusting tanks and shipwrecks lie in shallow waters, serving as artificial reefs, but also as reminders of destruction. For island communities, the war was not only about human loss. It reshaped their landscapes, leaving scars that endure to this day. The Pacific Islands campaign was vast, fragmented, and filled with stories that rarely make it into mainstream histories. From frozen Aleutian tundra to steamy New Guinea jungles, from the courage of Wake Island to the resilience of indigenous communities, the war stretched across an ocean and into every hidden corner. This was a war not only of fleets and admirals, but of forgotten villages, abandoned garrisons, and men who fought long after the world had stopped. It was a war that revealed the Pacific's immensity and humanity's vulnerability within it. The Pacific War unfolded across a theater so large that even today it is hard to imagine. Maps often shrink the ocean, compressing distances, but for the men and women caught in its campaigns, those distances were real, measured in weeks of sailing and months of isolation. The islands of the Pacific became waypoints and battlegrounds in this vast struggle. If Part 1 looked at the early expansion and some of the most surprising campaigns, this part turns toward the longer struggles. The grinding attrition, the forgotten outposts, and the human dimensions that marked the Pacific Islands War as unlike any other. Guadalcanal, the first great counteroffensive. In August 1942, the United States launched its first major offensive in the Pacific, landing Marines on the island of Guadalcanal in the Solomon Chain. The objective was simple yet vital: seize an airfield under construction by the Japanese, which threatened shipping routes between the US and Australia. The landings met little resistance at first, but within days Japanese forces counterattacked. What followed was 6 months of bitter fighting by land, sea, and air. The campaign became a test of endurance rather than swift conquest. For the Marines, conditions were miserable. The jungle swarmed with insects, rain fell relentlessly, and malaria weakened entire units. Supplies were often scarce. Men sometimes lived on captured rice. Japanese forces faced similar hardships, arriving in waves that often lacked sufficient food or ammunition. The naval battles around Guadalcanal were equally fierce. Night engagements in narrow waters earned the name Iron Bottom Sound, as so many ships were sunk that the seafloor became a graveyard of steel. Air battles raged daily, with both sides losing planes to combat, accidents, and exhaustion. By February 1943, the Japanese withdrew. Guadalcanal marked their first major land defeat and shifted the momentum of the Pacific War. Yet the human cost was staggering: tens of thousands killed, wounded, or sick. For many who fought there, the memories of hunger, fear, and exhaustion never left. The Solomons beyond Guadalcanal. Guadalcanal overshadowed the wider Solomon Islands campaign, but the struggle continued across other islands. New Georgia, Bougainville, and others became battlegrounds where American, Australian, and New Zealand troops faced entrenched Japanese defenders. One forgotten detail is how often battles were fought not for the entire island, but for specific airstrips or anchorages. An island might be bypassed, left to wither as Allied forces leapfrogged forward to more strategic points. Japanese garrisons isolated in this way endured slow starvation, cut off from supplies, but refusing to surrender. For the local populations, the war was devastating. Villages were destroyed, crops ruined, and families displaced. Many islanders assisted Allied forces as scouts and carriers, but they also bore the brunt of reprisals when discovered by the Japanese. The Solomons became not just a series of battles, but a shattered homeland for those who had lived peacefully there for centuries. The Gilbert and Marshall Islands. In late 1943, the United States turned to the Gilbert Islands, aiming to break into the Central Pacific. The most famous battle was Tarawa, a small atoll defended by a determined Japanese garrison. The landing in November 1943 became one of the bloodiest in Marine Corps history. Misjudged tides left landing craft stranded on reefs, forcing men to wait hundreds of yards under heavy fire. The beaches became scenes of chaos, with bodies piling in the surf. After 3 days of savage combat, the island was secured, but at the cost of over 1,000 American dead and nearly all of the 4,500 Japanese defenders killed. Tarawa shocked the American public. Newspapers carried photographs of the carnage, sparking debate about whether such heavy losses were acceptable for such tiny scraps of land. Yet the lesson was clear: every island would be costly, and Japan's defenders would not surrender easily. The campaign continued into the Marshall Islands in early 1944. Here, the strategy of island hopping took shape more fully. Instead of attacking every stronghold, the Allies bypassed some islands, isolating their defenders. This approach saved time and lives, though it left behind garrisons that slowly wasted away. Life on isolated outposts. For the Japanese soldiers left behind on bypassed islands, life became a slow ordeal. Cut off from supplies, they survived on coconuts, fish, and whatever they could forage. Some raided local villages, straining relations with islanders. Disease spread unchecked. American patrols sometimes encountered these outposts months or years after they had been cut off. Emaciated, often still defiant, the survivors embodied the Japanese military code that considered surrender dishonorable. In contrast, Allied soldiers on occupied islands also endured isolation. Small garrisons waited months for relief, living in tents or crude huts, battling boredom and tropical illness. Letters from home took weeks or months to arrive if they came at all. The war in the Pacific was not always about dramatic battles. It was often about waiting, surviving, and enduring the monotony of a faraway war. The Marianas and the turning tide. In June 1944, the Allies struck at the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. These battles were crucial, for from the Marianas, American bombers could reach Japan itself. Saipan became a ferocious struggle. Japanese forces fought desperately, knowing that losing the island meant Japan's defenses would be breached. The civilian population was caught in the middle. Propaganda had convinced many that Americans would commit atrocities. Tragically, thousands of civilians jumped from cliffs or committed suicide rather than surrender. Tinian, captured shortly after, became the base from which the atomic bomb missions would later launch. Guam, retaken after nearly 3 years of Japanese occupation, witnessed fierce fighting as well. The capture of the Marianas also triggered the Battle of the Philippine Sea, sometimes called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, in which American pilots destroyed hundreds of Japanese aircraft, crippling Japan's carrier force. These campaigns signaled that Japan's defeat was inevitable, though the cost in lives, soldiers and civilians alike, remained heavy. Indigenous perspectives. For island communities, the war was a rupture of unimaginable scale. Daily life was overturned. On Guam, Chamorro people endured years of Japanese occupation, forced labor, and harsh restrictions. In the Solomons, families were displaced, food supplies seized, and traditional ways of life disrupted. Yet local people also resisted in quiet ways. Some hid Allied airmen who crashed, risking death if discovered. Others carried supplies through jungles, scouted enemy positions, or simply survived amid destruction. After the war, many of these contributions went unrecognized, overshadowed by the grand narratives of admirals and generals. But without the knowledge, resilience, and courage of islanders, the war in the Pacific would have unfolded very differently. Forgotten naval battles. While Midway and Leyte Gulf are well known, other naval battles in the Pacific remain largely forgotten. Off the coast of the Solomons, night engagements became common, with cruisers and destroyers dueling in the dark, guided by radar or sometimes by the flash of gunfire. At the Battle of Savo Island in 1942, Japanese cruisers surprised and sank 4 Allied cruisers in a stunning victory. The disaster shocked the U.S. Navy and taught harsh lessons about underestimating Japanese night fighting skills. Elsewhere, small carrier battles tested new tactics. Planes launched from flat decks became the decisive weapon of the Pacific, replacing battleships as the symbols of naval power. Yet for the men aboard, life was tense and claustrophobic, with the constant risk of fire or explosion if a bomb or torpedo struck. Disease and the jungle enemy. In the Pacific Islands, disease was as deadly as bullets. Malaria swept through both Allied and Japanese forces, weakening entire divisions. Dysentery, dengue fever, and skin infections plagued soldiers constantly. Jungle conditions made combat uniquely grueling. Weapons rusted, boots rotted, and men carried leeches on their skin after wading through swamps. Visibility was often just a few yards, making ambushes and sudden firefights common. For Japanese troops, supply shortages worsened the toll. Many starved or died from untreated illnesses. For Allied troops, medical advances like atabrine tablets helped reduce malaria's impact, though the bitter yellow pills were despised by soldiers forced to take them daily. These struggles rarely make headlines, but they defined the experience of thousands. The war in the Pacific was as much about surviving the environment as defeating the enemy. By the summer of 1944, the Pacific War had turned decisively in the Allies' favor. From Guadalcanal through the Gilberts, Marshalls, and Marianas, they had pushed across thousands of miles, seizing island after island at terrible cost. Japanese forces, though still fierce, were increasingly isolated and weakened. Yet the war was far from over. Ahead lay the Philippines, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and countless smaller battles. For the islanders, the suffering continued. For soldiers, the hardships deepened. And for the world, the Pacific remained a vast expanse of struggle, sacrifice, and survival. When we think of World War II in Europe, we often picture vast armies clashing. The German blitzkrieg, the Soviet defense of Moscow, the Allied invasion of Normandy. But beneath these great battles, another war was unfolding, a quieter, shadowy conflict waged in city streets, mountain valleys, and secret hideouts. This was the war of the resistance movements, the underground networks of men and women who refused to accept occupation. The story of resistance is often told in fragments. Brave acts of sabotage, daring escapes, whispered networks of spies. Yet the full picture reveals something deeper. An entire hidden layer of warfare, one that stretched from Norway's frozen fjords to Greece's sun-baked villages, from the forests of Poland to the cafes of Paris. This chapter explores Europe's hidden resistance. It tells of the ordinary people who risked their lives, the secret codes and radios that carried messages across borders, and the women whose roles were vital yet often overlooked. While these movements rarely decided the war on their own, they shaped its outcome, kept alive the spirit of freedom, and left behind stories that still inspire. The spark of resistance. When German troops swept across Europe in 1940, many nations collapsed in weeks. Governments surrendered or fled, armies laid down arms. For a moment it seemed that Nazi domination was complete. But occupation brought resentment. Daily life under German rule was harsh. Food was rationed, radios were censored, and fear of arrest hung over every town. Slowly, small acts of defiance emerged. A banned newspaper secretly printed, a radio tuned to the BBC at night, a flag painted on a wall. At first, these acts were symbolic, but they carried meaning. They reminded people that the conquerors could not control everything. From these seeds grew networks that carried weapons, sabotaged railways, and smuggled information. Resistance began not with armies, but with individuals saying no. Norway, sabotage in the snow. One of the most famous but often underappreciated resistance efforts took place in Norway. After Germany invaded in April 1940, Norwegian forces resisted briefly, but were soon overwhelmed. Yet the spirit of resistance did not die. Norway was strategically important to Germany for two reasons. Its long coastline offered bases for submarines and ships, and its hydroelectric plants produced heavy water, a key ingredient in nuclear research. The Allies feared that Germany might use this to develop atomic weapons. In 1942-43, Norwegian resistance fighters trained in Britain launched daring raids on the heavy water plant at Vemork. Skiing across snowy mountains, carrying explosives in freezing winds, they slipped into the facility and destroyed vital equipment. Their mission was so successful that even decades later, it was celebrated as one of the great sabotage operations of the war. But Norway's resistance was not only about dramatic raids. Ordinary Norwegians risked their lives hiding Jews, smuggling them across the border into neutral Sweden. Underground newspapers spread information, and small acts of sabotage slowed German control. For every dramatic explosion, there were countless quiet acts of courage. France, underground networks. France, occupied in 1940, became the heart of resistance mythology. At first, resistance was scattered. Some joined Charles de Gaulle's Free French movement in exile, broadcasting from London. Others stayed behind, forming cells that printed newspapers, gathered intelligence, and prepared for action. By 1942, these efforts began to merge. Groups like the Maquis operated in rural areas, hiding in forests and mountains, launching ambushes and sabotaging railways. In cities, networks provided false papers, sheltered fugitives, and sent intelligence to Britain. The risks were enormous. The Gestapo infiltrated networks using informants and brutal interrogations. Capture often meant torture and execution. Yet still, the underground persisted. One of their greatest contributions came in 1944, when resistance groups rose up in support of the D-Day landings, disrupting German movements and seizing towns. A forgotten detail is how diverse the French resistance was. Communists, Catholics, liberals, students, farmers, people from all walks of life found common cause. Women played central roles, often underestimated by occupiers. They carried messages, transported weapons, and organized safe houses. Many paid with their lives. The French resistance was not a single movement but a mosaic of courage, stitched together across a conquered land. Yugoslavia, guerrilla warfare. In Yugoslavia, resistance grew into one of the most powerful movements in Europe. After Germany invaded in 1941, the country fractured, with occupation forces dividing its territory. In the chaos, two major resistance groups emerged, the Royalist Chetniks and the Communist Partisans. The partisans, led by Josip Broz Tito, proved especially effective. Operating in mountains and forests, they waged relentless guerrilla warfare. They sabotaged railways, ambushed convoys, and liberated entire regions for periods of time. Their strength grew so large that they tied down hundreds of thousands of Axis troops, forces that might otherwise have fought in Russia or France. The Yugoslav resistance was unique for its scale. It was not just a hidden underground, it became a full-fledged army. By the end of the war, Tito's partisans were recognized as one of the key Allied forces in Europe. Yet this story is often overlooked outside the Balkans, overshadowed by Western narratives. The fact remains that in Yugoslavia, ordinary men and women turned their land into one of the most difficult battlefields Germany ever faced. Greece, resistance and famine. In Greece, occupation brought both resistance and suffering. German, Italian, and Bulgarian forces divided the country, stripping it of resources. Famine spread in Athens during the winter of 1941-42, claiming hundreds of thousands of lives. Yet even in these desperate conditions, resistance grew. In the mountains, groups like Elas, the Greek People's Liberation Army, organized guerrilla bands. They blew up bridges, ambushed convoys, and harassed occupiers. One of the most famous operations was the destruction of the Gorgopotamos viaduct in 1942, carried out with British help. The explosion cut a vital railway line, disrupting German supply routes. Resistance was not only armed. Underground schools preserved Greek culture, and secret presses kept alive the spirit of independence. The price was high. Villages were burned, civilians executed in reprisals. Still, Greece's resistance showed that even under famine and terror, people found ways to fight back. Poland, the underground nation. Nowhere in Europe was resistance more determined than in Poland. Occupied by both Germany and the Soviet Union in 1939, Poland endured brutal repression. Yet beneath the surface, an entire underground nation took shape. The Polish Home Army, Armia Krajowa, became one of the largest resistance forces in occupied Europe, numbering hundreds of thousands. They maintained secret schools to preserve Polish culture, printed newspapers, and organized sabotage. They passed intelligence to Britain, including vital information about German rockets being tested at Peenemünde. One of the most extraordinary moments came in 1944, with the Warsaw Uprising. For 63 days, Polish fighters rose against German occupation, hoping to liberate their capital before the Soviet advance. They fought street by street, house by house, using homemade weapons and sheer determination. The uprising was eventually crushed, and Warsaw was left in ruins. But the bravery of the insurgents remains one of the most remarkable episodes of resistance in history. Poland's resistance also played a crucial role in revealing the Holocaust. Couriers risked their lives to carry reports about extermination camps to the outside world. Men like Jan Karski traveled through occupied Europe to alert Allied leaders to the horrors unfolding. The underground in Poland was not just military. It was cultural, spiritual, and national, preserving identity under an occupation that sought to erase it. Europe's resistance movements were diverse, some small and symbolic, others large and organized. From Norway's saboteurs to Poland's underground nation, they shared one common thread: the refusal to accept oppression as normal. Their actions slowed occupiers, aided Allied efforts, and inspired hope. But above all, they proved that even in the darkest times, people could resist, not only with weapons, but with culture, identity, and courage. The resistance in Europe was not a single unified force. It was many struggles unfolding at once, shaped by geography, politics, and the brutal choices that occupation imposed. In some countries, resistance meant small, symbolic acts. In others, it became large-scale guerrilla warfare. Always, it required courage, secrecy, and sacrifice. This part turns to the less celebrated but deeply significant aspects of the underground war: the role of women, the secret networks of codes and radios, the dangers of betrayal, and the quiet heroism that rarely reached the front pages of wartime newspapers. Women of the resistance. While history often highlights male fighters, women were at the heart of resistance movements. Their contributions were varied, vital, and often overlooked. In France, women served as couriers, carrying messages or weapons hidden in baskets, prams, or bicycle panniers. Because German soldiers underestimated them, they could pass checkpoints with less suspicion. Some women sheltered downed Allied pilots, hiding them in attics or barns until escape routes could be arranged. In Poland, women played central roles in the underground state. They taught in secret schools, worked as medics, and carried information. During the Warsaw Uprising, young women served in the little post office, delivering letters between barricades under sniper fire. In Norway and Denmark, women managed underground presses and broadcast information. In Greece, they smuggled food into cities during famine, defying occupation orders. Some became legendary. In France, Lucy Aubrac helped rescue her husband from Gestapo captivity and organized escapes for others. In Poland, Krystyna Skarbek, also known as Christine Granville, worked for British intelligence, gathering information and persuading German garrisons to surrender. Yet countless others remain nameless. For every famous story, thousands of women risked and often lost their lives. Their courage was quieter, less celebrated, but no less essential. The language of secrets, codes, and radios. Resistance movements relied on communication, and communication meant risk. To coordinate with allies, networks used coded messages transmitted by secret radios. These devices were often hidden in barns, attics, or even caves. Operators transmitted quickly, knowing that German direction-finding teams could locate them within minutes. In Britain, the BBC broadcast coded phrases to occupied countries, ordinary-sounding sentences that carried secret meanings. A phrase like "Jean has a long mustache" might be the signal for a sabotage mission to begin. To listeners in the know, these cryptic words carried enormous weight. Couriers carried messages across borders, often memorizing details in case they were searched. Some used microfilm, concealed inside fountain pens or sewn into clothing. The art of secrecy became as important as the art of battle. Failures could be devastating. When networks were infiltrated, entire cells were rounded up. In the Netherlands, the Englandspiel operation saw German intelligence capture Allied agents and use their radios to feed false information back to Britain, leading to further losses. Despite these dangers, resistance fighters continued. Without their information about troop movements, railway lines, industrial sites, the Allied war effort would have been blind. Sabotage as a weapon. One of the resistance's most effective tools was sabotage. While armies fought with tanks and planes, partisans fought with wrenches, explosives, and courage. In occupied France, resistance fighters derailed trains carrying German supplies. In Norway, they sank ferries transporting heavy water. In Poland, they cut telephone lines, blew up bridges, and even derailed troop transports. Sabotage did not always mean explosions. Workers in factories slowed production, misassembled parts, or deliberately introduced flaws into machinery. Railway employees delayed trains, misrouted shipments, or lost cargo. These small acts multiplied across a continent, sapped the occupiers' strength. The risk was extreme. Germans often responded with brutal reprisals, executing civilians or burning villages. In France, entire communities were massacred in retaliation for resistance actions. Yet people continued to take these risks, knowing that even small disruptions could weaken the Nazi war machine. The price of betrayal. Every resistance movement lived under the shadow of betrayal. Networks depended on trust, yet infiltrators, informants, and double agents were constant threats. In France, the Gestapo and Milice, the Vichy regime's paramilitary force, hunted resistance fighters relentlessly. A single betrayal could unravel an entire network. Men and women were arrested, tortured, and executed. Some betrayed others under duress, others did so for money or out of ideology. In the Netherlands, betrayal led to the capture of Anne Frank and her family, who had been sheltered in hiding. Her story, now world famous, was just one of many tragedies in which trust was broken and lives destroyed. For resistance fighters, betrayal was a daily fear. They lived knowing that a comrade might be captured, forced to reveal names, or turn voluntarily. Yet they persisted, building new networks when old ones were destroyed, refusing to give up even in the face of unimaginable losses. The role of youth. Resistance was not confined to adults. Teenagers and even children played roles. In occupied Poland, students attended underground schools, preserving their culture against Nazi bans. Young scouts carried messages and acted as lookouts. In France, groups of university students produced clandestine newspapers, spreading hope and information. In Denmark, young people helped ferry Jews to safety in Sweden. For many, the war years became their coming of age. Instead of classrooms, they found themselves on bicycles delivering coded notes or standing watch for patrols. Their bravery reminds us that resistance was not only the work of seasoned fighters, it was also carried on the shoulders of the young. Jewish resistance. Against overwhelming odds, Jewish communities also resisted. In ghettos across Eastern Europe, underground organizations formed. They smuggled weapons, published secret papers, and prepared for uprisings. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising of 1943 was the most famous. With few weapons, poorly armed fighters held off German troops for weeks, choosing defiance over submission. Though the uprising was crushed, it became a symbol of courage in the face of extermination. Elsewhere, Jewish partisans took to the forests, especially in Belarus and Lithuania. Bands of fighters ambushed German patrols, destroyed railways, and sheltered fugitives. Some groups were small, others large enough to challenge German control of entire regions. These stories challenge the misconception that Jews were passive victims. Resistance took many forms: armed struggle, cultural preservation, survival itself. To resist in a world designed for annihilation was itself an act of defiance. Clandestine printing and the war of words. Beyond sabotage and weapons, the resistance also fought with words. Underground newspapers spread information, countering propaganda. They reported Allied victories, exposed German lies, and reminded people that freedom was still possible. In France alone, hundreds of clandestine papers circulated, passed hand to hand, read in secret. Printing presses were hidden in basements and barns, constantly moved to avoid discovery. The simple act of reading such a paper was a crime, yet people risked everything to know the truth. Radio, too, became a lifeline. Listening to the BBC or Voice of America was forbidden, but families gathered in silence to hear news from beyond the occupation. These broadcasts connected occupied peoples to the wider world, preventing the occupiers from controlling their minds as well as their lands. Resistance in Europe was not only about battles in forests or raids on factories. It was also about women carrying messages in baskets, students printing papers in attics, and radio operators sending coded signals before fleeing rooftops. It was about betrayal and loss, but also about persistence and hope. The hidden war of Europe was made up of thousands of small acts, each dangerous, each vital. Together they formed a web of defiance that stretched across the continent. Though often forgotten in grand military histories, these acts of resistance remind us that ordinary people, armed with little more than courage, could defy even the most powerful of enemies. The Second World War is remembered through images of storming beaches, great tank battles, and generals poring over maps. But for every famous commander or headline-making division, there were millions of others, soldiers drawn from colonies, occupied lands, and distant countries. Their stories rarely make it into the textbooks, yet without them, the war could not have been fought, let alone won. This chapter is about the forgotten soldiers of World War II, the men from Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, and Latin America who fought in foreign lands, the women who served in overlooked roles, and the prisoners of war whose endurance remains largely unrecognized. Their sacrifices were immense, but history often treated them as footnotes rather than central actors. The Indian Army, the largest volunteer force. Perhaps the most remarkable but least remembered contribution came from the Indian Army. By the end of the war, it numbered more than 2.5 million men, making it the largest volunteer force in history. These men came from villages, towns, and cities across British India, Punjab, Bengal, Maharashtra, the northwest frontier. Many enlisted out of loyalty, others for wages, some under pressure. They fought in North Africa, where Indian divisions faced Rommel's Afrika Korps in the desert. They fought in Italy, climbing mountains and storming monasteries. Most famously, they fought in Burma, where the dense jungles tested them as they pushed back the Japanese. Conditions were brutal. Soldiers endured disease, monsoons, and long marches with heavy packs. Yet their role was decisive in halting Japan's advance into India. At battles like Impal and Kohima in 1944, Indian and British forces together turned the tide of the Burma campaign. Despite their contribution, recognition was slow. After the war, India's independence overshadowed the sacrifices of its soldiers who returned to a homeland divided by partition. For many, their service became a complicated memory, fighting for an empire even as their own people sought freedom from it. African soldiers in foreign wars. Africa's role in the war is often overshadowed by events elsewhere. Yet hundreds of thousands of Africans served in Allied armies. France mobilized its colonial troops, known as tirailleurs sénégalais, though they came from across West and Central Africa. These men fought in France in 1940, later in North Africa and Italy. Many were captured by the Germans and treated harshly, singled out for execution or brutal conditions as prisoners of war. Britain, too, raised divisions from Nigeria, Kenya, Uganda, and elsewhere. They fought in East Africa against the Italians, in the Middle East, and in Burma. Known as the King's African Rifles, they marched through jungles and deserts, often with limited supplies. The experience of African soldiers was marked by contradiction. They were praised for bravery, yet treated unequally. Pay was lower than that of European troops, rations smaller, recognition scarce. When the war ended, many veterans returned to villages where their service brought no pensions or rights. Yet their experiences planted seeds of change. Having seen the vulnerability of European powers, many returned with sharper demands for independence. Chinese soldiers against Japan. While the Western world often focuses on the Pacific Islands or Europe, China was a central battlefield of World War II. From 1937 until 1945, China fought a relentless war against Japanese invasion. Chinese soldiers endured conditions harsher than almost any other front. Poorly equipped, often lacking modern weapons, they faced a brutal enemy. The battles of Shanghai, Nanjing, and Wuhan in the late 1930s cost millions of lives. In the countryside, guerrilla forces harassed Japanese troops, tying down divisions that might otherwise have fought in the Pacific. The forgotten detail is the sheer scale of China's suffering and sacrifice. By the war's end, Chinese casualties numbered in the tens of millions, soldiers and civilians alike. Their resistance consumed vast Japanese resources, shaping the entire Pacific War. Without China's endurance, Japan could have deployed far more strength elsewhere. Yet Chinese soldiers rarely appear in Western accounts of the war. Their heroism was real, but geopolitics soon overshadowed their story, as civil war erupted after 1945, and memories of shared struggle gave way to new conflicts. Brazil's Expeditionary Force. In Latin America, only one nation sent troops to fight in Europe, Brazil. In 1944, the Brazilian Expeditionary Force, numbering about 25,000 soldiers, joined the Allies in Italy. These men, many of them young and inexperienced, were suddenly transported from tropical climates to the cold mountains of Europe. They fought in key battles including Monte Castello and Montese, earning respect from their allies. Their motto became famous: "The snake will smoke." It was a response to skeptics who claimed Brazil would send troops when snakes smoke pipes. In other words, never. The soldiers adopted the phrase with pride, proving the doubters wrong. Though their numbers were small compared to the vast armies in Europe, Brazil's contribution symbolized the truly global nature of the war. From South America to Italy, distant continents were drawn into the fight. Soviet soldiers from Central Asia. The Red Army was immense, and it drew soldiers from across the Soviet Union's vast territories. Men from Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Turkmenistan were conscripted and sent thousands of miles from home. For many, it was their first time outside their villages, their first encounter with modern industry and cities. They served in infantry, cavalry, and artillery units, often enduring terrible losses in battles from Stalingrad to Berlin. The diversity of the Soviet army is often forgotten. It was not only ethnic Russians who bore the brunt of the fighting. Central Asians, Siberians, and men from the Caucasus all contributed. Their sacrifices were immense, yet their stories rarely appear in the dominant narratives of the Eastern Front. Caribbean contributions. From the Caribbean, men volunteered to serve in British and Canadian forces. Pilots from Jamaica, Trinidad, and Barbados flew in the Royal Air Force, some becoming decorated aces. Others served in the Merchant Navy, braving U-boat attacks as they carried vital supplies across the Atlantic. The Caribbean also played a strategic role. Bases in Trinidad and other islands provided staging points for Allied convoys and aircraft. Yet the soldiers and sailors who served often faced discrimination, both abroad and upon returning home. Their wartime service, however, strengthened demands for greater political rights in their islands. The story of prisoners of war. Among the most forgotten soldiers were those who became prisoners of war. Millions were captured across Europe, Africa, and Asia, enduring years in camps far from home. British and American prisoners in Germany faced strict but generally Geneva-compliant conditions. Yet Soviet prisoners fared far worse. Millions were captured by the Germans in 1941, and many were left to starve or die of exposure. Conditions in these camps were catastrophic, with survival rates shockingly low. In Asia, Allied prisoners captured by Japan endured brutal treatment. Forced labor on projects like the Burma-Thailand Railway, later remembered as the Death Railway, claimed tens of thousands of lives. Prisoners endured malnutrition, disease, and abuse. These men fought no further battles, yet their endurance was another kind of heroism. Surviving captivity and carrying its scars for the rest of their lives was its own forgotten story of the war. World War II was not only fought by the great powers and their generals, it was fought by millions of forgotten soldiers, from Indian villages, African towns, Chinese battlefields, Caribbean islands, and Brazilian cities. They marched under foreign flags in distant lands for causes that were sometimes theirs and sometimes not. Their stories remind us that the war was truly global, and its sacrifices shared far beyond the familiar battlefields of Europe and the Pacific. The war's outcome rested not just on famous divisions, but on the courage of men and women whose names history seldom remembers. The global war brought millions of people under arms, yet the spotlight often falls only on a few. American GIs storming beaches, Soviet soldiers hoisting flags over Berlin, British pilots battling in the skies. But behind those images stood a mosaic of human contributions. In every corner of the world, men and women put on uniforms, fought, labored, and suffered. Most were never celebrated, but their presence shaped the course of the war. This part explores further the overlooked combatants, the Free French from Africa, the Italian soldiers who fought both for and against fascism, the overlooked Muslim and Jewish fighters, and the indigenous peoples who carried a war not of their choosing on their backs. Free French forces and African roots. When France fell in 1940, Charles de Gaulle called on his countrymen to continue the fight from abroad. But much of that fight came not from metropolitan France, but from Africa. Colonies in North and Central Africa became the backbone of the Free French Army. Tens of thousands of African troops rallied under the Free French banner. From Chad, Cameroon, Senegal, and Algeria, they marched north into Libya, joining the Allies in the desert campaigns. They fought at Bir Hakeim in 1942, where Free French forces, including many Africans, held off a vastly superior Axis force for weeks, delaying Rommel's advance and buying time for the Allies. Later, they took part in the liberation of Italy and France itself. Photographs of Free French forces entering Paris in 1944 often crop out the African faces that made up a large portion of those divisions. To avoid offending racist attitudes in liberated France, Allied leaders deliberately ensured that mostly white units paraded into the capital. The truth is that without African soldiers, the Free French effort would have been far weaker. These men fought not only for liberation, but also for a colonial empire that still denied them equality, a contradiction that would fuel post-war demands for decolonization. Italian soldiers, between fascism and resistance. Italian soldiers are often remembered as weak or ineffectual, caricatured in jokes about quick surrenders. The reality is more complex. Italy entered the war unprepared, with poorly equipped armies stretched across Africa, the Balkans, and the Mediterranean. Many soldiers endured defeat after defeat, not because they lacked courage, but because they lacked supplies, modern weapons, and effective leadership. Hundreds of thousands of Italians fought in North Africa, suffering in the same deserts as their German allies and British enemies. On the Eastern Front, entire Italian divisions fought alongside the Wehrmacht, enduring the devastating Soviet offensives of 1942-43. At Stalingrad, the Italian Eighth Army was shattered, with tens of thousands killed or captured. After Italy's surrender in 1943, many soldiers faced an impossible choice. Some joined the Allies, fighting to liberate their own country. Others were forced into service by the German-occupied puppet state in the north. Still others deserted or joined partisan bands. Forgotten in the jokes about quick surrender is the suffering of ordinary Italian soldiers caught between fascism, defeat, and civil war. Muslim soldiers of the war. World War II drew in soldiers from Muslim communities across the globe, yet their contributions are rarely highlighted. In North Africa, Muslim soldiers fought on both sides. Many Algerians, Moroccans, and Tunisians served in the French army, earning a reputation for toughness in battles from Italy to France. In the Middle East, Palestinian Arabs and Jews alike enlisted in the British Army, fighting in North Africa and later in Europe. The Indian Army included hundreds of thousands of Muslim soldiers from Punjab, Bengal, and what is now Pakistan. They fought in Burma, North Africa, and Italy, standing shoulder to shoulder with Hindus and Sikhs in the largest multi-religious force of the war. In the Soviet Union, Muslim communities from Central Asia were conscripted in vast numbers, many serving far from their homelands. For them, the war was both a duty and a bewildering displacement. These contributions remind us that World War II was not simply a clash of Christian-majority nations. It was a truly global conflict in which Muslim soldiers, like so many others, bore a heavy share of the burden. Jewish soldiers beyond the ghettos. The Holocaust defines Jewish history in the war, but it was not the only Jewish experience. Hundreds of thousands of Jews fought as soldiers in Allied armies. In the Soviet Union, entire divisions included Jewish soldiers, many of whom lost their families even as they fought to push back the invaders. In the United States and Britain, Jewish volunteers served in every branch of the armed forces. In Palestine, Jewish volunteers formed units within the British Army, some of which later became the nucleus of Israel's defense forces. Jewish partisans also took to the forests of Eastern Europe, launching raids, blowing up railways, and saving fellow Jews from deportation. They fought not just for survival, but for dignity in the face of annihilation. Their story is often overshadowed by tragedy, yet it deserves equal recognition. Jews were not only victims, but also fighters who resisted in uniform and out of it. Indigenous peoples in uniform. From the far reaches of the world, indigenous peoples also joined the fight. Some volunteered, others were conscripted, still others fought to defend lands caught in the path of war. In Canada, thousands of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis men enlisted, serving as snipers, scouts, and infantrymen. Their knowledge of wilderness survival proved invaluable. Many returned home to communities that still denied them full citizenship. In the United States, Native Americans enlisted in large numbers. The most famous were the Navajo code talkers, who used their language to create unbreakable codes that secured American communications in the Pacific. Their role was kept secret for decades, but it was vital in battles from Guadalcanal to Iwo Jima. In New Zealand, Maori battalions fought with distinction in Greece, North Africa, and Italy. Their fierce assaults earned them respect, though they too returned to a society still marked by inequality. These indigenous contributions show how the war reached even into the world's most remote communities, drawing them into struggles far beyond their homelands. The invisible front, labor and logistics. Not every soldier fought with rifles and bayonets. Millions served in roles that were less visible but equally essential. Indian and African soldiers built roads, carried supplies, and maintained lines of communication across jungles and deserts. Chinese laborers dug trenches, transported equipment, and endured bombing raids. Caribbean dock workers loaded ships under the threat of German submarines. The war could not have been fought without these laborers, yet because they were not on the front lines, their contributions were easily forgotten. They endured exhaustion, disease, and danger, often with little recognition. Prisoners turned soldiers. Another forgotten group were prisoners of war who later fought again. In Soviet captivity, some German and Italian soldiers were persuaded or forced to join anti-fascist units, broadcasting propaganda or even serving in combat under new banners. Likewise, Soviet prisoners captured by the Germans were sometimes coerced into serving in auxiliary units. Many did so only to survive, caught between two brutal regimes. Their stories complicate the black and white image of loyalty and treason, showing how survival often dictated choices. The war's forgotten soldiers came from every background: African riflemen, Italian conscripts, Muslim volunteers, Jewish partisans, indigenous code talkers. Their stories differ, but together they form a truth often overlooked. That World War II was not won by a handful of great powers alone. It was won and endured by millions drawn from every corner of the globe. They fought in deserts and jungles, on mountains and islands, in uniforms that were sometimes ill-fitting or improvised. They faced discrimination, poverty, and invisibility, yet they fought, and in doing so, they changed the course of history. War is often remembered for its generals and its battles, but behind the smoke of the front lines lay another battlefield, one fought in laboratories, workshops, and secret research facilities. The Second World War was not only a clash of armies, it was also a race of ideas. The innovations born in those years shaped not only the conflict itself, but also the decades that followed. Some of these scientific endeavors were triumphs: penicillin saving countless lives, radar guiding pilots through the dark, and computers beginning their long journey toward reshaping human life. Others were strange or even absurd: bat-guided bombs, pigeon-piloted missiles, bizarre chemical concoctions, and still others were horrifying, involving experiments on unwilling human beings, a shadowed part of history that remains deeply unsettling. This chapter explores the hidden world of science, secrets, and experiments during the war, what was invented, what was attempted, and how science became both humanity's savior and its accomplice. The birth of radar. When the war began, radar was a technology still in its infancy. It had been tested in the 1930s, but no one fully grasped how decisive it would become. Radar, short for radio detection and ranging, used radio waves to detect aircraft and ships at a distance. In Britain, scientists like Robert Watson Watt helped develop the Chain Home Network, a series of radar stations along the coast. When the Battle of Britain erupted in 1940, these stations gave early warning of incoming German bombers. Instead of scrambling fighters blindly, the Royal Air Force could intercept enemy planes at the right place and time. This invisible shield made a profound difference. It allowed Britain's small air force to stretch its resources, intercepting waves of German bombers with uncanny precision. To the pilots, radar meant they were no longer stumbling in the dark. It meant guidance, coordination, and a chance to resist. Radar technology expanded quickly. Ships gained radar to detect submarines at night. Artillery units used radar to aim more accurately. The war became a proving ground for a technology that would later guide planes across oceans and ships through storms. The secret of code-breaking. If radar gave vision, code-breaking gave insight. Throughout the war, both sides encrypted their communications using machines and ciphers to keep orders secret. Breaking these codes became one of the most secretive and consequential efforts of the conflict. In Britain, Bletchley Park became the heart of this battle. Mathematicians, linguists, and puzzle solvers gathered in its huts and mansions to tackle the German Enigma machine. Among them was Alan Turing, whose work on algorithms and early computers laid the foundation for modern computing. By building machines known as bombers, and later the Colossus computer, the codebreakers were able to crack German messages, sometimes within hours of transmission. This intelligence, codenamed Ultra, gave the Allies priceless knowledge about troop movements, submarine positions, and military plans. The secrecy was absolute. Few outside a small circle knew of these successes. Even generals were sometimes told only the outcome, not the source. The effect was immense. Convoys steered clear of U-boats, ambushes were avoided, and victories were won that might otherwise have been defeats. In the Pacific, a similar story unfolded with Japan's codes. American codebreakers deciphered messages that revealed the plan to attack Midway in 1942. With this knowledge, the U.S. Navy set a trap. turning the tide of the Pacific War. The hidden war of codebreakers saved countless lives, yet for decades it remained buried under secrecy. Only much later did the world learn that mathematics, patience, and machines had been as decisive as tanks or planes. Strange weapons and unlikely ideas. The desperation of war also gave birth to inventions that seem bizarre today. Some were born of genuine creativity, others of desperation, and a few of sheer eccentricity. One of the strangest was the idea of bat bombs developed in the United States. The concept was simple but extraordinary. Attach small incendiary devices to bats, release them over Japanese cities, and let them roost in buildings. When the devices ignited, fires would spread. Tests were even carried out, with bats carrying explosives into mock towns. Though the idea worked in principle, it was ultimately abandoned in favor of more conventional and far more destructive weapons. Another odd invention was the pigeon-guided missile. Psychologist B.F. Skinner proposed training pigeons to peck at a target image inside a missile's nose cone. The pecking would adjust the missile's course toward the target. Incredibly, the pigeons performed well in tests, but the military doubted the practicality and reliability of using birds to steer weapons. The British, meanwhile, devised sticky bombs, grenades coated with adhesive to cling to tanks. Soldiers testing them found that the bombs often stuck to the wrong things, including themselves, leading to dangerous mishaps. Then there was Project Habakkuk, a plan to build aircraft carriers out of ice reinforced with wood pulp known as pykrete. These floating fortresses were imagined as unsinkable platforms in the North Atlantic. A prototype was even built on a Canadian lake, and the material proved surprisingly durable. But the project was ultimately deemed too impractical and was abandoned. These odd inventions remind us of the creativity and desperation that war inspires. Not all ideas succeed, but in times of crisis, even the strangest notions are explored. Medical breakthroughs, penicillin and beyond. While some experiments bordered on the absurd, others saved lives on a massive scale. Among the most important was the development and mass production of penicillin. Discovered by Alexander Fleming in 1928, penicillin had remained a laboratory curiosity for years. During the war, researchers in Britain and the United States found ways to produce it in large quantities. By 1944, penicillin was being distributed widely to Allied troops. The impact was enormous. Before penicillin, infections from wounds often proved fatal. With it, soldiers survived injuries that would once have killed them. Gangrene, pneumonia, and sepsis became treatable. By war's end, penicillin had saved countless lives, both military and civilian. The war also spurred advances in blood transfusion, surgical techniques and trauma care. Mobile surgical units, air evacuation, and new anesthetics transformed battlefield medicine. These innovations did not end with the war, they reshaped civilian healthcare for decades to come, aviation and the jet age. Another major leap during the war was in aviation. At the start, most aircraft were propeller-driven. By the end, jet engines were taking to the skies. Germany led the way with the Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first operational jet fighter. Faster than any Allied plane, it posed a serious threat, but it arrived too late, produced in too few numbers to change the war's outcome. Britain and the United States also developed jets, preparing the ground for the post-war era of commercial air travel. Rocket technology advanced too, with Germany's VV-2 rockets striking London and Antwerp. These weapons of terror were the ancestors of modern ballistic missiles and space rockets. The skies of World War II were laboratories as much as battlefields. Out of their fires came technologies that would shape the Cold War and beyond. Science during World War II was a double-edged sword. It brought radar, code-breaking penicillin, and the dawn of jet aviation, technologies that saved lives and advanced humanity. But it also produced bat bombs, pigeon missiles, and weapons of terror. It revealed the brilliance of human creativity and the peril of its misuse. In the next part, we will explore the darker side of wartime science, the secret experiments on human beings, the race for the atomic bomb, and the ethical questions that still haunt us today. Science in war is never neutral. It can heal, but it can also harm. For every advance that saved lives, another brought suffering. During World War II, entire fields of science were pressed into military service, sometimes with noble results, sometimes with horrifying consequences. In this part, we turn to the shadows. The secret experiments carried out on unwilling human beings, the brutal medical programs run in camps and laboratories, and the race for new weapons whose destructive power outlived the war. These stories are difficult but necessary, for they remind us of how knowledge, when twisted, can serve cruelty as well as progress. Nazi medical experiments. Within the concentration camps of Nazi Germany, medicine became an instrument of atrocity. Under the guise of research, doctors conducted experiments that violated every principle of ethics. Prisoners were not patients. They were subjects, stripped of rights, treated as tools for curiosity or ideology. At Dachau, experiments tested human survival in extreme conditions. Prisoners were plunged into freezing water to study hypothermia. Others were placed in low-pressure chambers to simulate high-altitude flight, sometimes until death. These tests aimed to aid German pilots, but the price was unbearable suffering. At Ravensbrück, women endured bone, muscle, and nerve transplants. At Auschwitz, Josef Mengele carried out infamous experiments on twins, injecting chemicals, performing surgeries, and observing the results with chilling detachment. These acts produced little scientific value. They revealed more about cruelty than about medicine. Yet they left scars on the bodies of survivors and on the conscience of humanity. After the war, the Nuremberg doctors' trial exposed these crimes, leading to the Nuremberg Code, a cornerstone of modern medical ethics. Japan's Unit 731. On the other side of the world, another program unfolded in secrecy. Unit 731 of the Japanese Imperial Army. Based in Manchuria, this unit conducted biological warfare research on prisoners, many of them Chinese civilians. Victims were infected with plague, cholera, anthrax, and other diseases. Vivisections were carried out without anesthesia, organs removed for study while victims were still alive. Prisoners were exposed to frostbite, starvation, and other tortures in the name of research. Unit 731 also tested biological weapons, releasing plague-infected fleas into villages, causing outbreaks that killed thousands. What makes this history even more complex is what happened after the war. Some leaders of Unit 731 escaped prosecution, offering their research to the United States in exchange for immunity. Their crimes were buried under Cold War secrecy, their victims forgotten for decades. Chemical and biological weapons. Both the Axis and Allies explored chemical and biological weapons, though they were rarely used in combat in Europe. Memories of World War I's poison gas haunted leaders, yet research continued in laboratories. Germany stockpiled nerve agents like tabun and sarin, terrifying substances far deadlier than chlorine or mustard gas. They never used them on the battlefield, perhaps fearing Allied retaliation. Britain and the United States tested anthrax bombs, even contaminating a Scottish island, Gruinard, which remained dangerous for decades. Japan's use of biological weapons in China, however, was real and devastating. These programs revealed the fragility of restraint. The weapons existed, ready to be unleashed, but fear of retaliation kept them largely in check. The war showed both the temptation and the danger of wielding science as a weapon of mass destruction. The Manhattan Project. If one scientific effort defined World War II, it was the Manhattan Project, the race to build the atomic bomb. In 1939, physicists alerted President Roosevelt that Nazi Germany might be pursuing nuclear weapons. Fear of Hitler armed with an atomic bomb spurred the United States into action. The result was a massive secret program employing over 130,000 people across sites in Los Alamos, Oak Ridge, and Hanford. Scientists from around the world, including refugees from Europe, worked on the project. Among them was Robert Oppenheimer, who became scientific director. The project combined theoretical physics, engineering, and industrial production on a scale never seen before. In July 1945, the first bomb was tested in the New Mexico desert. The explosion lit the sky, turning sand into glass. Oppenheimer later recalled a line from Hindu scripture, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." Weeks later, atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The cities were leveled, tens of thousands killed instantly, many more dying from radiation and injuries. The war ended soon after, but the dawn of the nuclear age had arrived. The Manhattan Project remains one of the most controversial scientific achievements in history. It ended a brutal war, but at a cost that still haunts humanity. It showed that science could create not only medicine and machines, but weapons capable of annihilation. Secrets kept, secrets revealed. One feature of wartime science was secrecy. Projects were hidden from the public, known only to small circles. Workers in factories often had no idea what they were building. Information was compartmentalized, guarded as tightly as battle plans. After the war, many secrets remained buried. The full story of code breaking at Bletchley Park was not revealed until the 1970s. The details of Unit 731 stayed hidden even longer. The world learned about the atomic bomb only when it was used, not before. This secrecy protected nations but also complicated history. It left gaps in public understanding, myths that filled the void. Only decades later did the pieces come together, revealing how much of the war was fought in laboratories and offices, not just trenches and skies. Ethics in the shadow of war. The war forced humanity to confront difficult questions. Is every scientific discovery justified if it helps win? Can research on unwilling subjects ever be excused by results? Is the use of a devastating weapon acceptable if it saves lives by ending a conflict? These questions were not answered easily. After the war, the Nuremberg Code established principles: voluntary consent, informed participation, avoidance of unnecessary suffering. These became the foundation for modern medical ethics. The atomic bomb, meanwhile, sparked debates that continue today about deterrence, responsibility, and survival. Scientists who built it were divided. Some believed it ended the war swiftly, others felt deep regret. The war showed that science is never just about discovery. It is about how that discovery is used, and for whom. The darker side of wartime science is a sobering reminder. While radar and penicillin saved lives, other programs destroyed them. While code-breaking shortened battles, experiments in camps and laboratories inflicted agony. While the atomic bomb ended one war, it opened the door to another kind of fear. Science during World War II was not simply progress. It was a mirror, reflecting both the heights of human ingenuity and the depths of human cruelty. When people imagine war, they often think of tanks rolling, planes diving, and cities burning. Yet alongside the violence, Another dimension thrived: culture. Even in times of devastation, people sang songs, read newspapers, went to the cinema, painted murals, wrote poems, and played sports. Some of these cultural expressions were shaped by governments as tools of propaganda. Others emerged from ordinary people trying to hold on to normal life. World War II was not only a clash of armies, but also a clash of stories, images, and sounds. Propaganda posters lined city streets while soldiers carried pocket-sized novels in their packs. Musicians performed for troops at the front, and cartoon characters waged their own battles on cinema screens. This chapter explores those cultural curiosities, sometimes odd, sometimes inspiring, sometimes tragic, that reveal how deeply the war touched daily life and imagination. Propaganda as culture. Propaganda was not simply about leaflets or speeches. It was a cultural force, shaping art, film, music, and literature. Every major nation poured resources into crafting images and narratives that would inspire, intimidate, or persuade. In Germany, Nazi propaganda under Joseph Goebbels reached into every corner of cultural life. Films glorified the regime, posters emphasized unity and strength, and radio broadcasts carried Hitler's voice into homes. Architecture itself became propaganda, with rallies staged in monumental spaces designed to awe. The Allies, too, mastered propaganda. In Britain, posters urged people to keep calm and carry on, or reminded them that careless talk costs lives. These phrases, once urgent wartime warnings, later became cultural symbols remembered long after the war. In the United States, the Office of War Information worked with Hollywood publishers and artists. Posters showed Rosie the Riveter flexing her arm. "We can do it." Cartoons ridiculed Axis leaders. Even comic book superheroes like Captain America joined the fight, punching Hitler on the cover of his very first issue in 1941. Propaganda blurred into culture, leaving behind images still familiar today. It was not just a tool of war, it was part of the artistic and cultural fabric of the time. Music in wartime. Music offered comfort, distraction, and motivation. Soldiers carried songs with them while civilians gathered around radios to hear familiar melodies. In Britain, Vera Lynn became known as the force's sweetheart, singing songs like "We'll Meet Again" that expressed longing and hope. Her voice carried across battlefronts, reminding men of home. To this day, her songs remain tied to the memory of wartime Britain. In the United States, swing and big band music dominated. Glenn Miller's orchestra played for troops, and Miller himself joined the Army Air Forces, traveling to perform in Europe. His disappearance in 1944, when his plane vanished over the English Channel, became one of the war's enduring mysteries. In Germany, the regime controlled music carefully, banning jazz as degenerate because of its African-American origins. Yet secretly, young Germans known as swing kids gathered to listen anyway, using music as quiet rebellion. In prisoner of war camps, music was survival. Prisoners made instruments out of scrap, forming choirs and orchestras. Music became a way to remember humanity when everything else was stripped away. The war shaped music, but music also shaped the war, offering strength in moments of despair. Cinema and cartoons. Film was one of the most powerful cultural weapons of the era. In the United States, Hollywood studios worked closely with the government. Frank Capra directed the Why We Fight series, explaining the war to American audiences. Animated films starred characters like Bugs Bunny and Donald Duck mocking Hitler and Mussolini. Walt Disney produced training films for the military, blending entertainment with instruction. In Britain, films like In Which We Serve told stories of courage and endurance. In Germany, Leni Riefenstahl's earlier propaganda films remained iconic examples of how cinema could glorify ideology. Cartoons too carried messages. Popeye fought not just Bluto but also Axis enemies. Superman appeared in patriotic shorts. These images reached children, shaping their understanding of the war through colorful animation. Even newsreels shown in cinemas were cultural experiences. Before television, people learned about battles and bombings through moving images on the big screen, accompanied by stirring narration. Audiences watched together, reacting as one, cheering victories, gasping at destruction. Cinema was not just entertainment. It was a stage where the war itself was performed, explained, and remembered. Literature and poetry. Books did not stop being written in wartime. In fact, the war spurred a flood of publications, from cheap paperbacks for soldiers to poetry that captured the moment. In Britain and the United States, publishers printed armed services editions, small, lightweight books that soldiers could slip into pockets. These editions included classics, mysteries, and romances. They were read in trenches, on ships, and in camps, offering escape and comfort. Poetry thrived, too. In occupied countries, poets wrote secretly, their words circulating underground. Paul Éluard in France penned verses of resistance. In Poland, poets captured both tragedy and defiance, keeping national identity alive. Even in camps, prisoners wrote. Some scribbled lines on scraps of paper, others memorized verses to keep them alive. Literature became resistance, survival, and memory. Sports during the war. Sport, surprisingly, did not vanish during the war. In fact, it sometimes flourished in unlikely places. In occupied Poland, prisoners in camps organized secret football matches, playing under the eyes of guards. In Britain, professional leagues paused, but exhibition games kept spirits alive. Soldiers played matches during lulls using makeshift balls and fields. One of the strangest stories comes from the 1942 death match in Kiev, where a team of Ukrainian players, many former professionals, played against German military teams. According to legend, after defeating the Germans, some players were arrested and later executed. While historians debate the exact details, the story became a symbol of courage through sport. Even at the front, soldiers kicked balls around during breaks just as they had in World War I. Sport reminded them of normal life, of home, of play. It was culture preserved in the midst of destruction. Rumors and urban legends. Wartime culture was not only official or artistic, it was also rumor. In every occupied city, whispers spread that liberation was near, that Hitler had died, that Allied armies were already across the Channel. Some rumors were deliberate, planted by propaganda. Others were born of hope. They circulated in cafes, factories, and bread lines, shaping morale as much as any official speech. Urban legends, too, thrived. Stories of miraculous escapes, of ghostly apparitions, warning of bombs, of strange coincidences. People clung to these tales as ways of making sense of chaos. Even jokes became a form of cultural resistance. In Germany, people whispered political jokes at great risk. In occupied France, humor mocked both the occupiers and the hardships of rationing. These jokes were not trivial. They were survival, ways of keeping spirit alive when silence threatened to suffocate. Culture during World War II was a battlefield of its own. Propaganda posters, songs on the radio, cartoons in cinemas, poems written in secret, all became part of the struggle. Some served governments, others served hope. Still others were small acts of rebellion. The war changed culture, but culture also changed the war. It gave people strength, distraction, and meaning. It turned fear into laughter, absence into song, despair into poetry. These curiosities remind us that even in the darkest years, people created, expressed, and imagined. Culture in wartime was not limited to posters, music, and cinema. It seeped into clothing, theater, diaries, daily rituals, and even food. People adapted their creativity to scarcity. They found ways to express themselves even when materials, time, and freedom were in short supply. This part of the chapter explores those everyday cultural experiences that reveal how people endured, resisted, and sometimes even thrived. Fashion under rationing. The war reshaped fashion in ways that went far beyond uniforms. With textiles rationed, clothing became practical, durable, and inventive. In Britain, the government introduced the Utility Clothing Scheme in 1941. Designers created simple garments that used minimal fabric, avoiding excess pleats, cuffs, or buttons. Clothes were stamped with the CC41 mark, meaning Controlled Commodity 1941. Yet scarcity also inspired creativity. Women repurposed curtains into dresses, turned men's suits into coats, and stitched patches to extend the life of worn-out garments. Stockings were hard to find, so some women painted lines down the backs of their legs with makeup to mimic seams. In occupied Europe, clothing could also be a form of resistance. Wearing national colors or traditional garments, even subtly, was a quiet way of affirming identity. In Denmark, women sometimes wore red and white ribbons in their hair to symbolize national pride. In Poland, hidden badges or embroidery carried secret meaning. Fashion became culture under constraint, adaptation to necessity, but also a statement of resilience. Theater and performance. Even during bombardments and occupations, people sought performance. Theater continued across Europe, sometimes with official approval, sometimes in secret. In London, the West End carried on despite the Blitz. Audiences sat in darkened theaters while bombs fell outside. Theaters became sanctuaries, places where for a few hours people could laugh, cry, and forget the destruction. In occupied countries, theater was more dangerous. In Poland, underground performances preserved culture. Secret plays were staged in basements or private apartments, keeping alive works banned by the occupiers. In France, theaters sometimes cooperated with German authorities, but actors and playwrights also smuggled resistance messages into scripts, using symbolism and subtle lines that audiences understood. For soldiers, theater troops toured bases and front lines. In the United States, the USO, United Service Organizations, brought entertainers like Bob Hope to perform for troops. His quick humor and light-hearted shows became iconic, lifting spirits on battlefields far from home. Performance in wartime was never just entertainment. It was survival, morale, and sometimes defiance. Diaries and personal writings. Some of the most poignant cultural traces of the war come from diaries and letters. While official propaganda shaped grand narratives, personal writings captured daily life, private fears, and small joys. The most famous is Anne Frank's diary, written in hiding in Amsterdam. Her words have become a symbol of innocence amid cruelty, yet her experience was one of thousands. In Warsaw, Renia Spiegel recorded her thoughts before she was killed in the ghetto. In Britain, teenagers described blackouts, rationing, and air raids in their journals. Soldiers, too, kept diaries. They wrote in notebooks on scraps of paper, even on the backs of ration cards. Some wrote poetry, others described marches and battles, others simply recorded meals and weather. These writings were often never meant for publication, yet they became invaluable records. They remind us that culture is not only paintings and songs, but also private words that reveal how ordinary people lived through extraordinary times. Food culture and rationing. Food is culture, and in wartime it became a daily struggle. Rationing reshaped diets everywhere. In Britain, butter, sugar, meat, and eggs were strictly limited. Creative cooks invented recipes like carrot cake without sugar or Walton pie, a vegetable dish named after the Minister of Food. Housewives listened to radio programs teaching them how to stretch ingredients and avoid waste. In Germany, rationing also tightened, though the regime tried to maintain appearances. Occupied territories were stripped of resources, leaving local populations hungry while supplies were diverted to the German military. In the United States, rationing was less severe but still significant. Victory gardens were promoted, with families growing vegetables in backyards and empty lots. By 1944, millions of such gardens supplied a large share of the nation's produce. In occupied countries, food became not only sustenance, but resistance. Smuggling, black markets, and secret farming sustained populations when official supplies failed. Sharing food was an act of solidarity, Withholding it could be an act of oppression. Cooking, eating, and sharing meals carried culture forward even in famine and fear. Humor as resistance. Humor may seem out of place in war, but it was one of the most important cultural tools of endurance. Jokes circulated quietly, mocking leaders and lampooning hardship. In Nazi Germany, political jokes were dangerous, punishable by imprisonment. Yet people told them anyway. "Why is the Führer so sunburned?" one joke asked. The answer, because he spent so much time under the sun of Italy. Humor was survival through laughter. In occupied France, jokes targeted rationing and German soldiers. In Britain, cartoonists like David Lowe mocked Hitler with biting satire, lifting spirits while challenging fear. Even in prisoner-of-war camps, humor thrived. Prisoners staged mock parades, wrote satirical newspapers, and found comedy in absurd conditions. Laughter helped them endure, reminding them that they still controlled something the enemy could not take away: their wit. Humor in war became both shield and sword. Cultural symbols of resistance. Symbols became powerful cultural weapons. Flags, songs, and even graffiti carried meaning beyond their simple forms. In occupied Norway, people wore paper clips on their clothing as a discreet sign of unity. In Poland, graffiti of the letter P with an anchor symbol representing Polska Walczaka or Fighting Poland appeared on walls. In Czechoslovakia, students sang banned songs in public squares as acts of defiance. Religious rituals also carried cultural resistance. In secret masses or ceremonies, communities found ways to affirm identity and hope. Weddings, funerals, and baptisms continued despite curfews and raids, preserving continuity when everything else was shattered. These small symbols mattered. They reminded people that culture was not erased by occupation. It lived in signs, songs, and acts of quiet courage. Occupation and cultural exchange. Strangely, war also produced cultural exchanges. Soldiers stationed abroad encountered new foods, music, and customs. American soldiers in Britain brought swing music and chewing gum, while British soldiers in North Africa discovered spices and traditions unfamiliar to them. Some of these exchanges were welcomed, others resented. In France, American jazz spread after liberation, influencing post-war music. In Italy, soldiers shared cigarettes and chocolate with children, leaving memories that lasted decades. Even in occupied lands, cultures mixed in unexpected ways. German soldiers encountered local traditions, sometimes adopting them informally, sometimes clashing with them. These exchanges left complex legacies, some bitter, some surprisingly enduring. Culture in wartime was not only grand propaganda or heroic art. It was in the fabric of everyday life, in patched clothing, improvised recipes, whispered jokes, and scribbled diaries. It was in plays staged in cellars, music sung in camps, and symbols painted on walls. These cultural curiosities reveal that even when freedom was crushed, imagination was not. Culture adapted, resisted, and survived. It gave people not only distraction but also dignity. In small ways, it kept humanity alive when war tried to erase it. When wars are remembered, the spotlight usually falls on the battlefield. Armies clashing, tanks advancing, cities falling. But wars are not fought only by soldiers. Behind every front line is another front, the home front, where civilians endured bombings, rationing, fear, and change. World War II reshaped daily life for millions who never carried a weapon. Children grew up with air raid sirens instead of lullabies. Parents queued for hours to buy a few ounces of butter or sugar. Families listened anxiously to the crackle of radios waiting for news. Communities were displaced, and women entered workplaces that had once barred them. This chapter looks at the home front, the struggles, adaptations, and quiet endurance of civilians across the world. Their war was different, but no less real. Britain, under the Blitz. Few images of the home front are as enduring as Britain under the Blitz. Beginning in September 1940, German bombers targeted London and other cities night after night. Entire neighborhoods were flattened, flames lighting the sky. Civilians became soldiers of endurance, holding fast in the face of destruction. Londoners took refuge in underground stations, sleeping on platforms as trains continued to run. Families carried bedding and makeshift meals down into tunnels. Children played between tracks while parents tried to pretend life was normal. The smell of damp concrete, the sound of bombs thudding above, it became part of daily routine. Despite the destruction, morale held. People queued for buses the morning after raids, stepping over rubble to get to work. Shops hung signs reading, "More open than usual," reminding customers that life went on. The Blitz was not only about London. Coventry, Liverpool, Birmingham, and many other cities endured devastating raids. The destruction left scars that lasted decades, but it also forged resilience. Civilians on the home front proved that war could be resisted not only with guns, but with endurance. Children in wartime Britain. One of the most remarkable efforts on the British home front was the evacuation of children. In 1939, Operation Pied Piper relocated over 1 million children from cities to the countryside. They traveled with name tags around their necks, small suitcases in hand, not knowing where they would end up. For some, evacuation meant safety and adventure, fields, animals, and a new life. For others, it meant loneliness, poor treatment, or homesickness. Letters home described both excitement and fear. Parents in cities faced the agony of separation, unsure when or if they would see their children again. Even those who stayed in cities adapted. Schools moved into basements or were relocated entirely. Children practiced putting on gas masks in classrooms. They played among ruins, turning bomb sites into makeshift playgrounds. Childhood continued, reshaped by war. Rationing and everyday life. The war transformed food culture in Britain. Rationing began in 1940, limiting basics like meat, sugar, butter, and eggs. Everyone carried ration books, carefully saving coupons for weekly allowances. Meals became simpler. Recipes used carrots instead of sugar, powdered eggs instead of fresh. Lord Woolton, the Minister of Food, promoted Woolton pie, a dish of vegetables in a potato crust. Housewives tuned in to radio programs teaching how to make the most of scarce supplies. Yet rationing also encouraged fairness. Everyone, from factory worker to aristocrat, had the same ration. It created a sense of shared sacrifice, and despite shortages, British health actually improved. Less sugar, less fat, more vegetables. The war reshaped not only diets, but attitudes toward food. Germany, total war at home. Life on the German home front was shaped by the regime's drive for total war. From the beginning, propaganda assured civilians of quick victory. But as the war dragged on, shortages deepened, bombings increased, and fear spread. German civilians endured heavy Allied bombing campaigns. Cities like Hamburg, Dresden, and Berlin were reduced to ruins. Families huddled in shelters while firestorms raged outside. For many, survival meant scavenging among rubble, fleeing to the countryside, or queuing for hours for scarce food. Women carried heavy burdens. With men at the front, they managed factories, farms, and households. The Nazi regime glorified their role as mothers and homemakers, but necessity pushed them into broader roles. Fear was constant. Speaking against the regime could bring denunciation. Listening to foreign radio was a crime. Yet even in Germany, humor and rumor circulated, mocking leaders, expressing doubt. The home front was a mix of endurance, conformity, and quiet resistance. The Soviet Union, survival under siege. No home front endured more suffering than the Soviet Union's. When Germany invaded in 1941, entire cities were drawn into war. The most harrowing example was Leningrad. Surrounded for nearly 900 days, the city endured one of history's longest sieges. Food ran out quickly. Civilians survived on bread made partly from sawdust. Pets were eaten, wallpaper paste boiled for meals. Winter froze the city with little fuel for heating. Yet Leningrad held. Orchestras performed symphonies in freezing halls. Broadcasts carried music across the city as a symbol of defiance. Civilians dug trenches, built fortifications, and endured bombings. Over 1 million people died, but the city never surrendered. Elsewhere, Soviet civilians evacuated industries eastward, rebuilding factories beyond the Urals. Women and children worked long hours in fields and plants, producing weapons and food for the Red Army. The Soviet home front was one of the most brutal, yet also one of the most resilient. The United States, the arsenal of democracy. The American home front, spared the destruction of bombings, became the great supplier of the war. Factories that once made cars now produced tanks and planes. Shipyards launched vessels at astonishing rates, sometimes completing ships in weeks. Women entered the workforce in record numbers, symbolized by Rosie the Riveter. They worked in factories, shipyards, and offices, proving that industry could not run without them. While many left jobs after the war, their presence reshaped gender roles permanently. Rationing existed, but the United States enjoyed relative abundance compared to Europe. Victory gardens sprang up, with families growing vegetables at home. War bonds, sold with patriotic campaigns, funded the effort. Entertainment, films, music, sports flourished, often tied to wartime themes. The U.S. home front was marked less by survival and more by mobilization. It was here that the phrase, "the arsenal of democracy," became reality, as factories and workers supplied not only American forces but also allies across the globe. Japan. Scarcity and sacrifice. Life on the Japanese home front was shaped by scarcity and the constant pressure of war. From early in the conflict, resources were diverted to the military, leaving civilians with little. Rationing was severe, with rice in short supply and substitutes like millet or barley used instead. Children collected metal scraps, women sewed uniforms, communities held patriotic rallies. Propaganda emphasized loyalty and sacrifice, urging families to give all for the emperor. As the war turned against Japan, air raids devastated cities. In 1945, firebombing destroyed vast portions of Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya. Civilians fled into shelters or rivers, but entire neighborhoods burned. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki brought devastation beyond comprehension. For Japanese civilians, the home front was marked by hunger, fear, and loss. Yet diaries and letters show moments of normality, school lessons, festivals, small joys amid scarcity. Even in war's darkest moments, daily life continued. The home front was not one story, but many. In Britain, it meant shelters and ration books. In Germany, it meant propaganda and rubble. In the Soviet Union, it meant survival at the edge of starvation. In the United States, it meant factories roaring with production. In Japan, it meant sacrifice and devastation. Civilians did not carry rifles, yet they bore the war in their own ways, through hunger, fear, labor, and endurance. Their resilience, sacrifices, and adaptations shaped the war as much as any battlefield victory. The home front looked very different under occupation than it did in free nations. In countries conquered by Germany, Italy, or Japan, daily life was marked not only by scarcity, but also by constant fear. Civilians lived under curfews, censorship, and the presence of foreign soldiers in their streets. Yet even here, people found ways to adapt, to resist quietly, and to preserve their communities. France, occupied and divided. France's defeat in 1940 left the country divided. The German-occupied north and the collaborationist Vichy regime in the south. For ordinary French people, the occupation transformed daily life. German soldiers patrolled streets, requisitioned homes, and imposed strict regulations. Food shortages became severe, with rations of bread, meat, and butter far below basic needs. Long queues formed outside bakeries and markets. Families supplemented meals with black market goods or by bartering with farmers. Censorship controlled newspapers, radio, and film. Propaganda promoted the Vichy ideal of work, family, fatherland, but many distrusted these messages. Underground presses sprang up, printing resistance papers that circulated secretly. Life in France also meant difficult choices. Some cooperated with occupiers to survive, others risked everything to resist. Many tried simply to endure, protecting their families while hoping for liberation. The war blurred lines between collaboration and survival, leaving scars that lingered long after 1945. The Netherlands, Hunger Winter. The Netherlands endured occupation from 1940 to 1945. At first, life continued with some semblance of normality, but as the war dragged on, conditions worsened. By 1944-45, in the so-called Hunger Winter, famine struck. German blockades and destroyed infrastructure left cities without supplies. Food rations dropped to as little as 400-800 calories per day. Families boiled tulip bulbs to eat. Children grew gaunt and weak. Thousands died of starvation. Yet even in hunger, Dutch families tried to preserve normal life. Schools, when possible, continued. Diaries recorded daily struggles and small victories, such as finding a potato or sharing a piece of bread. Communities banded together, helping each other survive. The memory of the Hunger Winter remained powerful in Dutch society, shaping how the nation remembered the war, not only as a time of battle, but as a time of starvation endured by civilians. Greece, famine, and resistance. Greece suffered one of the harshest occupations in Europe. Axis forces divided the country. Germany held Athens and key ports. Italy controlled much of the countryside, and Bulgaria occupied the north. Resources were stripped from Greece to feed Axis armies, leaving civilians hungry. By the winter of 1941-42, famine swept Athens. Bread was scarce, and malnutrition spread rapidly. Thousands died in the streets. Yet Greeks also resisted. Villages sheltered partisans in the mountains. Families shared what little food they had. Underground schools and newspapers kept culture alive. Women played vital roles, smuggling supplies and passing messages. The dual experience of famine and resistance shaped Greece's memory of the war. It was a time of immense suffering, but also of solidarity and defiance. Scandinavia, occupied but defiant. In Norway and Denmark, occupation brought restrictions, but also resilience. In Norway, German forces sought to control key ports and industries. Civilians endured rationing and censorship, but they also expressed quiet resistance. Paperclips worn on lapels became symbols of solidarity. Teachers refused to indoctrinate children with Nazi ideology, risking arrest. In Denmark, the government initially cooperated with Germany, but resistance grew over time. In 1943, a remarkable act of civilian courage saved thousands of Danish Jews. Ordinary citizens ferried them across the sea to neutral Sweden, often in fishing boats under cover of night. This mass rescue showed how home fronts could turn defiance into life-saving action. Women on the home front. The war transformed the role of women everywhere. With men at the front, women stepped into new responsibilities. In Britain, women joined the Women's Land Army, working in fields to keep the nation fed. They served in civil defense, manning fire stations during the Blitz, and worked in factories producing weapons. In the Soviet Union, women not only worked but also fought. While this belongs partly to the battlefield, it began at home. Girls learned to drive tractors, repair machinery, and weld steel. Mothers held families together under constant shortages. In Germany, Nazi ideology praised women as mothers and homemakers, yet reality forced many into factories. By 1943, with the war going badly, women were mobilized for labor despite earlier promises. In occupied countries, women often bore the heaviest burdens, queuing for food, caring for children, risking arrest if suspected of aiding resistance. Many became couriers, nurses, or organizers for underground networks, their work hidden but vital. The war did not create gender equality, but it shifted expectations permanently. Women proved they could run farms, factories, and offices, reshaping post-war societies. Children's experiences. Children on the home front lived a war of fear and disruption. Their schooling was interrupted, their homes destroyed, their childhoods marked by loss. In Britain, evacuations separated children from parents. In Germany, Hitler youth programs sought to indoctrinate them while bombings turned childhood into survival. In the Soviet Union, children endured hunger, sieges, and sometimes took on adult work. Yet children also found ways to adapt. They played among ruins, collected scrap metal for war drives, and shared stories in shelters. Diaries from the time reveal how they understood war, not in terms of strategy, but in terms of missing fathers, strange new foods, and the sound of sirens at night. The war imprinted itself on a generation of children, shaping their lives long after peace returned. Occupied Asia, civilian struggles. The home front in Asia was no less harsh. In territories occupied by Japan, China, Korea, the Philippines, Malaya, Burma, civilians endured forced labor, hunger, and violence. In Nanjing, Shanghai, and other Chinese cities, occupation brought brutal massacres and daily terror. In Korea, civilians were conscripted for labor in mines and factories, while women were forced into sexual slavery as so-called comfort women. In the Philippines, families endured shortages and reprisals, while guerrillas fought in the jungles. Despite suffering, civilians resisted. They hid fugitives, shared supplies, and maintained traditions under duress. In the Philippines, underground schools and newspapers kept communities connected. In Malaya, civilians aided resistance fighters, often at great personal risk. The home front in Asia was marked by the same themes as in Europe: hunger, oppression, endurance, but often with even greater brutality. The home front in occupied lands was not passive. Civilians suffered, but they also adapted, resisted, and preserved culture. Women stepped into new roles, children endured fear and hunger, and communities held together under immense strain. While armies fought on battlefields, civilians fought to keep families alive, to preserve dignity, and to resist erasure. Their war was quieter, but it was fought every day in breadlines, in shelters, in classrooms, and in whispered acts of courage. World War II is remembered for its great turning points: Stalingrad, Normandy, Midway, El Alamein. Yet the war was so vast that countless battles, campaigns, and skirmishes faded from memory, overshadowed by more dramatic events. For the soldiers and civilians who lived through them, however, these battles were anything but small. They were moments of terror, endurance, and sacrifice. This chapter revisits some of those forgotten battles. They were not always decisive in shaping the outcome of the war, but they reveal the scale of the conflict, stretching across deserts, jungles, mountains, and seas. They remind us that history is not only the story of famous victories, but also of overlooked struggles where lives were lost and futures altered. The Winter War, Finland versus the Soviet Union. Before the world was consumed by total war, a smaller but ferocious conflict erupted in late 1939, the Winter War between Finland and the Soviet Union. Stalin, seeking territory and security near Leningrad, demanded concessions from Finland. When Finland refused, Soviet forces invaded in November. The Red Army expected a swift victory, but the Finns fought back with ingenuity and courage. Using skis to move quickly across snow, Finnish soldiers launched ambushes in forests, their white camouflage blending with the landscape. They used Molotov cocktails, bottles of gasoline with burning cloth wicks, to destroy Soviet tanks. Despite being outnumbered, they inflicted heavy losses. One of the most legendary figures was Simo Häyhä, a Finnish sniper credited with hundreds of kills, earning the nickname the White Death. His skill became a symbol of Finnish resistance. Ultimately, Finland was forced to cede territory in March 1940, but its defense shocked the world. The Winter War showed that small nations could resist great powers, even if only for a time. The Battle of Narvik, another little-remembered campaign, took place in Norway in 1940. Narvik, a small town above the Arctic Circle, became a strategic prize because of iron ore shipped from Sweden through its ice-free port. When Germany invaded Norway in April 1940, Allied forces, including British, French, and Polish troops, attempted to seize Narvik. Fierce battles unfolded in snowy mountains and icy fjords. Naval clashes in narrow waters cost both sides ships. On land, soldiers fought in freezing conditions, sometimes waist-deep in snow. By June, the Allies captured Narvik, their first significant victory of the war. But the triumph was short-lived. With France collapsing under German invasion, the Allies withdrew, abandoning Norway. Germany retook Narvik and Norway remained occupied until 1945. Though overshadowed by larger campaigns, Narvik was a glimpse of how global the war would become, fought in places far from the main theaters. The Battle of Crete. In May 1941, Germany launched an airborne invasion of the Greek island of Crete. It was the first large-scale use of paratroopers in history, and it nearly ended in disaster for the attackers. British, Greek, Australian, and New Zealand forces defended the island, joined by Cretan civilians armed with little more than farming tools. When German paratroopers descended, they faced fierce resistance. Many were killed before they could regroup. For days, the outcome hung in the balance. Eventually, German forces secured airfields, allowing reinforcements to land. The Allies withdrew, and Crete fell. But the cost to Germany was enormous. Thousands of paratroopers were killed or wounded, and Hitler never again approved such large-scale airborne assaults. Crete became a forgotten turning point, demonstrating both the daring and the limits of airborne warfare. For the people of Crete, the battle was just the beginning. Resistance against the occupation was fierce, with villagers hiding fighters and attacking German patrols. Reprisals were brutal, with massacres of civilians, yet the memory of their defiance endured long after the war. The Burma campaign begins. In Southeast Asia, one of the longest and harshest campaigns of the war unfolded in Burma, modern-day Myanmar. When Japan invaded in 1942, British, Indian, Chinese, and Burmese forces faced a daunting challenge. The jungles of Burma were dense, humid, and filled with disease. Roads were few, rivers often flooded, and monsoons turned the land into mud. Japanese troops experienced in jungle warfare advanced rapidly. Allied forces retreated in one of the longest marches of the war, hundreds of miles on foot with little food, many collapsing from exhaustion or illness. The fall of Burma cut off China's supply route, isolating it further against Japan. For years, the campaign would grind on, with battles fought not only against the enemy, but against nature itself. Though often overlooked compared to Europe or the Pacific, Burma became a crucible for tens of thousands of soldiers. For many, the memory of leeches, malaria, and endless green forests haunted them long after the war ended. The Battle of Hong Kong. In December 1941, as Japan launched its assault on Pearl Harbor, it also struck British-controlled Hong Kong. The colony's defenders included British, Canadian, Indian, and local troops. Despite courage, they were vastly outnumbered. Japanese forces advanced rapidly, crossing from the mainland onto the island. The defenders fought street by street, hill by hill, but after 17 days, Hong Kong fell on Christmas Day. The surrender marked one of the darkest moments for the defenders, especially the Canadians who had just arrived and faced overwhelming odds. Civilians endured harsh occupation, and prisoners of war suffered terrible conditions. The Battle of Hong Kong is often forgotten outside Canada and Hong Kong itself, but it was part of the global eruption that December, showing how quickly the war spread across continents. The Philippines. The fall of Bataan. At the same time, another forgotten struggle unfolded in the Philippines. After Japan attacked in December 1941, American and Filipino forces retreated to the Bataan Peninsula. For months, they held out against superior numbers. Food and medicine ran short. Soldiers survived on half rations, malaria spread, and ammunition dwindled. Despite exhaustion, they fought fiercely. By April 1942, they could hold no longer. Tens of thousands surrendered in what became one of the largest capitulations in American military history. What followed was the infamous Bataan Death March. Prisoners forced to march over 60 miles with little food or water, thousands dying along the way. For years, Bataan symbolized both courage and tragedy. Yet in the broader sweep of the war, it was overshadowed by later victories. The men who endured it, however, never forgot. These early and often overlooked battles, Finland's frozen resistance, Narvik's snowy clash, Crete's airborne gamble, Burma's jungle ordeals, Hong Kong's brief stand, Bataan's desperate defense, show how global the war was from the very beginning. They remind us that World War II was not only fought in the famous places, but in remote towns, islands, and forests. For those who lived through them, these battles were no less significant, no less deadly, and no less real. The war's scale meant that entire campaigns, even when vast in size, faded from wider memory. While Stalingrad and Normandy became symbols, other battles were eclipsed, sometimes because they ended in failure, sometimes because they took place in remote corners, and sometimes because later events overshadowed them. In this part, we turn to battles that reveal the endurance of soldiers and civilians in places rarely remembered: desert sieges, coastal raids, mountain passes, and naval duels hidden among the thousands of engagements of the war. The Siege of Tobruk. In North Africa, the port city of Tobruk in Libya became the focus of one of the war's longest sieges. In 1941, after Rommel's Africa Corps advanced into Libya, Australian, British, and other Allied troops held Tobruk against repeated assaults. For 8 months, the defenders, later known as the Rats of Tobruk, endured constant bombardment, dust storms, and shortages. Living in dugouts and caves, they faced both enemy fire and the relentless desert environment. The siege was more than symbolic. By holding Tobruk, the Allies denied Rommel a vital supply base and tied down Axis forces. The defense boosted morale across the Allied world, showing that Axis advances could be resisted. Though eventually relieved, Tobruk's story is often overshadowed by the larger North African battles like El Alamein. Yet for the men who held the line, it was a defining experience of courage and endurance. The Dieppe Raid. In August 1942, Allied forces launched a raid on the French port of Dieppe. The goal was to test German defenses, gather intelligence, and demonstrate commitment to opening a second front. The raid involved mostly Canadian troops supported by British commandos and a small number of Americans. But almost everything went wrong. The element of surprise was lost. Tanks bogged down on beaches, and German defenses proved too strong. Within hours, over half the force was killed, wounded, or captured. The raid was a disaster. For Canada, Dieppe became a national wound. So many lives lost in what seemed a futile operation. Yet lessons learned there about amphibious assaults, air support, and coordination would prove vital in planning the D-Day landings 2 years later. Dieppe remains both a tragedy and a stepping stone, its memory preserved most deeply in Canada, even if often overlooked elsewhere. The Battle of Kohima. In 1944, one of the most brutal yet forgotten battles was fought in northeast India, Kohima. Japanese forces, seeking to invade India, advanced through Burma and reached the hill town of Kohima. British and Indian troops, heavily outnumbered, defended the area in desperate conditions. At the heart of the battle was the tennis court of the Deputy Commissioner's residence, where opposing trenches lay only yards apart. For weeks, Soldiers fought hand to hand, exchanging grenades and gunfire across a space smaller than a sports field. Eventually, reinforcements arrived, and the Japanese were forced to retreat. The battle, along with Imphal, marked the turning point of the Burma campaign. Kohima is remembered for a haunting epitaph on the memorial. When you go home, tell them of us and say, "For your tomorrow, we gave our today." Though vital, Kohima is often absent from global memory, overshadowed by Europe and the Pacific. Yet it was here, in remote hills, that Japanese expansion was finally checked. The Adriatic Islands, the Adriatic Sea, along the coast of Yugoslavia, became the site of a little-known struggle. Partisan forces, supported by the Allies, used the islands as bases to harass Axis supply lines and garrisons. Small boats carried supplies under cover of darkness, evading German patrols. British commandos cooperated with Tito's partisans, launching raids and sabotage missions. The islands shifted hands, sometimes occupied, sometimes liberated, in a war of persistence rather than grand battles. For civilians, island life was precarious. Families were caught between occupiers and partisans, facing reprisals from both sides. Yet the islands became symbols of resistance, showing how even remote places contributed to the broader struggle. The Battle of Madagascar. In 1942, the Allies feared Japan might use Madagascar, controlled by Vichy France, as a base to disrupt Indian Ocean shipping. To prevent this, they launched Operation Ironclad. British and Commonwealth forces landed near Diego Suarez, facing determined resistance from Vichy troops and Malagasy defenders. The fighting was intense, with naval bombardments and jungle skirmishes. It took months to secure the island fully. Though strategically important, Madagascar is rarely mentioned in World War II histories. Yet its capture safeguarded vital sea routes and showed how the war reached even into the Indian Ocean. The Battle of the River Plate. In December 1939, one of the war's earliest naval battles unfolded off the coast of South America. The German pocket battleship Admiral Graf Spee, after raiding Allied shipping, was cornered by 3 smaller British cruisers near Uruguay. In the ensuing battle, the Graf Spee inflicted damage but was itself heavily hit. Seeking refuge in Montevideo harbor, the German captain was pressured by false intelligence suggesting superior British forces awaited him. Rather than risk his crew, he scuttled the ship. The River Plate battle was a morale boost for the Allies in the early dark days of the war. Yet today it is often overshadowed by later, larger naval clashes. The Forgotten Aleutians, the Aleutian Islands, stretching off Alaska, saw one of the war's strangest campaigns. In 1942, Japanese forces occupied Attu and Kiska, the first foreign occupation of U.S. soil since 1812. For a year, harsh weather and fog defined the campaign. In May 1943, American forces retook Attu in a brutal battle of cold, mud, and close combat. At Kiska, when U.S. and Canadian troops landed in August, they discovered the Japanese had secretly evacuated. Still, friendly fire and accidents caused hundreds of casualties. The Aleutians campaign had little strategic impact, but it revealed the war's reach into the most remote and inhospitable places. For those who served there, the memory of fog, frostbite, and isolation never faded. The Battle of Eniwetok. In early 1944, U.S. forces assaulted Eniwetok Atoll in the Marshall Islands. The battle was overshadowed by Tarawa and later Saipan, but it was fierce and costly. Japanese defenders dug in across multiple islets, forcing Marines and Army troops into brutal close combat. Progress was slow, with flamethrowers, grenades, and artillery used to clear bunkers. After several days, the atoll was secured, providing a crucial airfield for the advance toward the Marianas. Though less famous, Eniwetok was part of the relentless island-hopping strategy that brought Allied forces closer to Japan. From Tobruk's dusty siege to Kohima's desperate tennis court, from Dieppe's tragedy to Madagascar's forgotten shores, these battles showed the diversity of World War II. Some were failures, others hard-fought victories, but all were part of the mosaic of global conflict. They remind us that history is selective. Some battles become symbols, while others fade into obscurity. Yet for those who fought them, these struggles were no less real, no less defining. The guns fell silent in 1945, but the war did not simply end. Its echoes lingered in ruins, in displaced families, in shattered economies, and in the memories of survivors. Soldiers returned home changed. Civilians emerged from shelters into cities reduced to rubble. The war's end was both relief and reckoning. Relief that the killing had stopped, reckoning with what it had cost. The aftermath of World War II was as global as the conflict itself. Nations rebuilt, empires dissolved, and new rivalries emerged. Memory, too, became part of the struggle. What to commemorate, what to forget, and how to tell the story of the most destructive war in human history. This chapter explores those first years of peace. The ruins left behind, the trials of justice, the lives of displaced people, and the ways societies tried to rebuild and remember. Cities in ruins. When peace came, Europe and Asia were landscapes of devastation. Entire cities were unrecognizable. In Germany, Berlin was a wasteland of rubble. Photographs show women known as Trümmerfrauen, rubble women, clearing bricks from collapsed buildings stone by stone to begin rebuilding. Dresden, Hamburg, Cologne, cities once vibrant, were reduced to shells. In Japan, the destruction was equally staggering. Tokyo had been firebombed into charred ruins. Hiroshima and Nagasaki bore scars of atomic devastation, flattened in seconds, with radiation leaving invisible wounds that lasted decades. Warsaw in Poland had been almost completely destroyed after the 1944 uprising. Only fragments of the old city remained, yet Poles meticulously rebuilt it stone by stone after the war as an act of cultural defiance. The ruins were not only physical, they were psychological. Survivors carried trauma, grief, and silence. The ruins of cities mirrored the ruins in hearts and minds, refugees and displacement. The end of the war unleashed one of the largest movements of people in history. Millions were displaced. Prisoners of war released, forced laborers freed, survivors of camps searching for homes, civilians fleeing new borders. In Europe, German populations were expelled from territories handed to Poland and Czechoslovakia, forced to march westward. Families carried what little they could, walking along roads crowded with refugees. Many died from hunger, exposure, or violence. Holocaust survivors faced a different kind of displacement. Many returned to homes only to find them destroyed, occupied, or hostile. Pogroms even erupted in some places after the war, driving survivors to seek new lives elsewhere. Displaced persons camps were set up where people waited months or years before emigrating to new countries. In Asia, millions were uprooted. Koreans, once forced laborers under Japan, returned to a divided homeland. Chinese civilians displaced by war faced famine and civil conflict. Across Southeast Asia, returning colonial powers clashed with independence movements, leading to new waves of refugees. The aftermath of the war was not peace, but movement. Millions searching for belonging in a world redrawn. War crimes trials. One of the most significant aspects of the aftermath was the attempt to bring justice through trials. In Nuremberg, leading Nazis were prosecuted for crimes against humanity, war crimes, and crimes against peace. For the first time, leaders were held accountable in an international court for aggression and genocide. The trials revealed horrific evidence of concentration camps, forced labor, and massacres. 12 were sentenced to death, others to prison. In Tokyo, similar trials were held for Japanese leaders. They faced charges for waging aggressive war and for atrocities in China and across Asia. Sentences ranged from execution to imprisonment. The trials set precedents for international law, but they were not without controversy. Critics argued they were victors' justice, as Allied actions, such as the bombing of cities, were not prosecuted. Yet for many, the trials symbolized an attempt to establish accountability, however imperfect. The question of collaboration. As nations rebuilt, they also confronted painful questions. Who had collaborated with occupiers, and how should they be judged? In France, women accused of relationships with German soldiers were publicly humiliated, their heads shaved in town squares. Trials were held for those who had served Vichy or aided the Gestapo. Some were executed, others imprisoned. In the Netherlands, collaborators faced similar treatment, while resistance fighters gained honor. In Norway, Vidkun Quisling, whose name became synonymous with treachery, was executed for aiding the Nazis. Yet collaboration was not always clear-cut. Some had cooperated to protect families, others to survive. Occupation blurred the lines between guilt and necessity. Post-war justice was uneven, sometimes harsh, sometimes forgiving. The reckoning with collaboration was part of the larger reckoning of memory, how nations chose to tell the story of their war. The return of soldiers. For millions of soldiers, the war ended with a return to civilian life, but the transition was not easy. In the United States, returning GIs were welcomed with the GI Bill, which provided education, housing, and support. This helped create prosperity in the post-war years. Yet veterans also carried psychological scars, what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. Many struggled in silence. In Britain, soldiers returned to austerity and rationing as the nation rebuilt under economic strain. Promises of a better society fueled support for reforms, including the founding of the National Health Service in 1948. In the Soviet Union, soldiers returned as heroes but also faced hardship. Cities were destroyed and millions of men did not come home. Veterans often found themselves struggling to rebuild lives amid shortages and political repression. In Asia, returning soldiers sometimes found home unrecognizable. Japanese veterans returned to bombed cities and a society grappling with defeat. Chinese soldiers returned to a nation sliding into civil war. The return was often bittersweet, joy of survival mixed with the challenge of rebuilding. The birth of the United Nations. Amid the devastation, nations sought a new order to prevent future wars. In 1945, representatives from 50 countries gathered in San Francisco to draft the Charter of the United Nations. The UN was built on the lessons of the League of Nations, aiming to be stronger and more inclusive. It created a Security Council with permanent members, the US, Soviet Union, Britain, France, and China, reflecting the new balance of power. Its goals were peace, cooperation, and human rights. In the immediate aftermath, it became a forum for addressing refugee crises, rebuilding efforts, and the seeds of decolonization. Though the UN would struggle with Cold War divisions, its creation symbolized hope. That out of destruction, a framework for peace could emerge. The aftermath of World War II was not a single moment of peace, but a process of reckoning. Cities lay in ruins, refugees wandered in search of homes, trials sought justice, and nations tried to rebuild. The war had ended, but its consequences were only beginning. In the next part, we will explore how the war reshaped empires, economies, and societies, and how memory of the war became part of politics and identity. The end of the war left not only ruins and refugees, but also questions about the future. The old order had collapsed. Empires that once spanned continents were weakened. Economies lay shattered. And amid the ruins, new powers emerged, reshaping the global balance. The war's aftermath was not only about rebuilding, it was about redefining nations, identities, and the world itself. Decolonization and the end of empires. World War II accelerated the unraveling of European empires. Colonies had provided soldiers, labor, and resources, yet their loyalty had been tested. Many returned from the war questioning why they should continue to live under foreign rule. In India, more than 2 million men had served in the British Indian Army. Their service, combined with economic hardship and growing nationalist movements, fueled momentum for independence. By 1947, just 2 years after the war, Britain granted independence to India and Pakistan. Across Africa, returning soldiers also demanded change. Men who had fought in Burma, North Africa, and Italy returned to find the same colonial restrictions at home. Their service planted seeds of independence movements that would grow in the 1950s and 1960s. In Southeast Asia, Japan's occupation had shattered the myth of European invincibility. In Indonesia, nationalist leaders declared independence in 1945, sparking a conflict with Dutch forces. In Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh proclaimed independence, setting the stage for decades of struggle. The war did not immediately end colonialism, but it made its continuation impossible. The age of empire had been fatally wounded. Economic recovery and the Marshall Plan. Economies across Europe lay devastated in 1945. Factories were destroyed, transport systems broken, currencies weakened, food shortages persisted, and rationing continued in many countries for years. The United States, untouched by destruction at home, emerged as the world's economic giant. Recognizing that poverty and instability could fuel communism, the U.S. launched the Marshall Plan in 1948. Billions of dollars in aid helped rebuild Western Europe's economies, modernize industries, and restore confidence. Britain used Marshall aid to rebuild housing and industry, though austerity continued. West Germany, devastated and divided, used aid to spark an economic miracle in the 1950s. France and Italy also recovered rapidly, their economies transformed by new investment and trade. In contrast, the Soviet Union rejected Marshall aid, seeing it as a tool of American influence. Instead, it tightened control over Eastern Europe, establishing planned economies under communist rule. Economic recovery reshaped the balance of power. Western Europe grew prosperous under American support, while Eastern Europe remained under Soviet dominance. The war's aftermath created not only ruins, but two different paths of reconstruction. The Cold War begins. Out of the ashes of World War II rose a new rivalry, the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union, allies during the fight against fascism, quickly became adversaries in shaping the post-war world. Disagreements over Germany, Eastern Europe, and atomic weapons deepened mistrust. By 1947, Winston Churchill was already speaking of an Iron Curtain dividing Europe. The Marshall Plan and the Truman Doctrine committed the U.S. to resisting communism, while the Soviets consolidated their hold over countries like Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. The memory of the war was used as a weapon in this new conflict. In the West, fascism was portrayed as a warning against totalitarianism of any kind. In the East, the Soviet Union claimed credit as the true vanquisher of Nazism, justifying its control over neighbors. Thus, the war's aftermath was not peace, but a new kind of struggle, ideological, political, and nuclear. The Holocaust remembered. One of the most profound reckonings after the war was with the Holocaust. As Allied forces liberated camps in 1945, the world confronted the scale of Nazi atrocities. Piles of bodies, emaciated survivors, gas chambers, images of horror that defied comprehension. At first, the focus was on trials and immediate relief for survivors, but gradually the Holocaust became central to memory of the war. Memorials were built, testimonies recorded, and education developed to ensure it would not be forgotten. For survivors, the path was difficult. Many had lost entire families, their homes destroyed or occupied. Displaced persons camps became temporary homes until emigration to Israel, the United States, or other countries became possible. The Holocaust changed how the world thought about human rights, genocide, and memory. It led to the 1948 Genocide Convention and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Out of the horror came new principles: though the challenge of living up to them would remain. Japan's defeat and transformation. Japan's aftermath was unique. The only nation subjected to atomic bombing, it faced devastation across dozens of cities, a collapsed economy, and millions homeless. Under American occupation led by General Douglas MacArthur, Japan was rebuilt. A new constitution in 1947 renounced war, establishing Japan as a peaceful nation. Land reforms redistributed property, democratization reshaped politics, and economic reforms laid the groundwork for later prosperity. Yet the shadow of Hiroshima and Nagasaki lingered. Survivors, known as hibakusha, suffered long-term health effects and social stigma. Memory of the bombings became central to Japan's identity, emphasizing both victimhood and a commitment to peace. Japan's transformation was rapid, turning from militarism to democracy, from devastation to economic growth. But the trauma of defeat left deep scars in memory and culture. Memory in the Soviet Union. For the Soviet Union, the Great Patriotic War became the defining story of its 20th century identity. The immense suffering, 27 million dead, cities destroyed, was remembered through monuments, parades, and narratives of sacrifice. The Soviet regime emphasized heroism, unity, and the role of the Communist Party in victory. Memory was controlled, focusing on triumph rather than tragedy. Stories of collaboration, of deported minorities, or of soldiers executed for retreat were suppressed. Yet among families, private memory told a different story: hunger, loss, repression, grief. For many Soviet citizens, the war was both a source of pride and of pain, shaping generations long after 1945. Memory in the United States and Britain. In the United States, memory of the war became tied to the idea of the good war. Americans remembered liberation, industrial might, and victory. The GI Bill, suburban growth, and economic prosperity reinforced the sense of triumph. The darker aspects, such as Japanese-American internment, were less often discussed until decades later. In Britain, memory centered on endurance. The Blitz spirit, Churchill's speeches, and the image of a nation that had stood alone in 1940. Even amid post-war austerity, pride in survival and contribution to victory shaped national identity. Both nations built cultural myths around the war, myths that inspired unity but also simplified the complex realities of conflict. The war's aftermath was a time of endings and beginnings. Empires dissolved, new nations emerged, and economies rebuilt. The Cold War divided the world, while memories of the Holocaust, Hiroshima, and countless other tragedies demanded reckoning. Each nation remembered differently, shaping identity, politics, and culture. The war had ended, but in memory it remained alive, guiding choices, inspiring myths, and haunting consciences.